There were 2 hours left until the third bell rang. If the stone of measure showed ash, Kyrena wouldn't be led out of the cutting hall through the upper door. She'd be taken down the lower passage to the dock and sold to the Glass Guild as a living prop for someone else's ritual. He'd seen the shipping slip with his own eyes. Custodian Garvin Dahl had left it on the table under a mug. Number 41, age 15. Expected stage, ash. Price, 8 silver weights. Garvin didn't even wait for the reading. He'd counted the money in advance. At the Debt Measure Orphanage, that's how they always did things. Here, no one was called by name. Here, they were called by the number that was branded on the inside of their wrist on the day the child was entered into the debt register. Kyren was entered there at the age of 4. His mother had died owing 16 weights for treatment that hadn't helped. Debt does not die with a person. Debt is passed on. That was the first rule of the Cadron Empire that Kyren had memorized. The second rule hung on the wall of every hall in every council chamber and every barracks. A person is worth exactly as much as their gift is worth. At the age of 15, every subject was led to the stone of measure. The stone read what had been imbued in the person at birth. There were 6 tiers: dust, tin, copper, silver, gold, the crown. Dust meant nothing had been imbued. Tin granted the right to a trade. Copper granted the right to a guild. Silver opened the path to service. Gold opened the path to a house. The crown was born once in a generation and usually into one of the great houses, which in itself was a peculiarity that no one discussed aloud. Dust opened no path at all. Ashes were not a death sentence. Ashes were a sentence to be used. Kyren lay on the straw and stared at the ceiling. He knew what his lot would be. He had known it for 15 years, because he had a memory. Not the memory of a boy from the orphanage, the memory of 100 lives. He had died 100 times. He had been a salt worker in a world where the sun rose twice. He had been a scribe in a city on the back of a beast. He had been a spearman and a herdsman and a glassblower and a thief. And once he had been king for 3 weeks until he was poisoned at breakfast. He remembered the sound of a language that no longer existed. He remembered the taste of water from 7 different rivers. He remembered how to hold a chisel, how to mend a net, and how to count an army by the dust on the horizon. He remembered everything except one thing. He didn't remember why. 100 lives, and in not a single one did he linger long enough to understand the meaning. And in each of the 100 he had a gift, however weak, even if it was flawed, but it was there. And in this one, there was none. Fate had given him 101st body and left him empty. It was the cruelest joke ever played on him. To know how any world works and have nothing with which to seize it by the throat. Obad roused the others by striking the iron frame with a bucket. Obad was the guard and had led the children in their reading for 16 years in a row. He had copper. His gift was called the grip. His fingers never unclenched. He could hold a struggling adult man with one hand for half a day. He said that in 16 years, exactly 1 child had escaped from him, and that child had drowned. He said this every year, using the exact same words. They were led out into the courtyard and lined up by number. 18 people. Drest stood at the front because he was 2 months older and because he beat up anyone who stood closer to him. He turned and said that Kyren should say goodbye to his bowl while he still had it. He said that the Glass Guild's barges were leaving at noon and that the ritual stands would last until the 3rd ritual. He laughed, and the others laughed too. Una Pell didn't laugh. Una was a year younger and had been taken in for the reading early because she'd been sewing for the whole neighborhood for 3 years, and the workshop had submitted a petition. Her fingers were red, and she kept her hands tucked inside her sleeves so no one would see. Kyren looked at her and said that if she were assigned to the tin workshop, She should immediately request a transfer to the sewing workshop and refuse the mobile kitchen, no matter how they tried to explain it to her. She asked how he knew. He replied that he'd seen how it ended. He'd seen it in his 47th life and his 63rd, and in two others that had already become jumbled together. The cutting hall stood on the square above the river, a gray, windowless box. Inside, it smelled of wet stone and burnt wax. The stone of measure stood in the center on 4 supports, a block of cloudy glass as tall as a man. Seated at a table nearby was Master Andres Kale, the appraiser for the Guild of Measure in Halvin. A thin man with a very straight back and very pale hands. He never raised his voice, he simply took notes. People feared him more than the guards because the guards could make mistakes, but the record was never wrong. Onlookers lined the walls, relatives, guild members, and 2 guards. Garvin Dahl stood right by the door with a folder under his arm, already holding a lead seal at the ready. The reading proceeded quickly. The child placed his palm on the stone. A spark lit up inside the glass and rose like a bubble. Kale named the level and took notes. Copper. Tin. Tin. Ash. The boy with the ash was taken away immediately, and he didn't even realize what had happened. Copper. Yuna placed her palm on the stone, and the glass gave off an even, tin-colored light. Kale wrote it down and said that the workshop could submit a petition. Yuna turned and met Chiron's gaze. He nodded. Then they called out number 41. Chiron walked toward the stone. 12 steps. He counted them because in his 47th life, he'd been led to his execution, and he'd counted the steps then too, and for some reason, it helped. He placed his palm on the glass. Nothing. The glass remained cloudy. Kale waited 10 heartbeats and recorded the ashes. Garvin was already walking toward the table with the invoice. And then the stone cracked. It didn't shatter. A single thin line simply ran across it from top to bottom. And within that line, for a split second, symbols appeared that Chiron didn't recognize from any of his 100 lives. And in his right forearm, it felt as if a nail had been driven in. He didn't scream. Over the course of 100 lifetimes, he'd learned not to be the first to scream. He pressed his hand to his side and counted to 5. The pain subsided. A brand appeared beneath his skin, stretching from his elbow to his wrist. 2 bowls on a rocker arm, 10 divisions between them. 9 were light. 1 had already darkened. Chiron raised his head, and the world changed. A line hung above every person in the hall. He saw it not with his eyes, but with that part of himself that remembered 100 deaths. Above Yuna stood her name and the word thread and the weight 12. Above Dressed stood his name and the word bone and the weight 19. Above Obad stood his name and the word grip and the weight 21. Above Garvin stood the word count and a weight of 34, which explained why the orphanage's records never matched the truth, but always matched themselves. And above Master Andres Kale stood a stranger's name. Not Andres, not Kale. Chiron read it and felt his fingers grow cold. Above his own name, he saw nothing. No rank, no weight. Just 2 words. Judge of Judgments. And beneath them, a single line that he understood immediately and completely, just as one understands one's native language. Name the 2 true names and swap the places of what is embedded within them. Garvin stamped the receipt. Kale said that number 41 had been written off against the debt and that the Glass Guild would take it by noon. No one was surprised. Dressed said that was all. Obad took Chiron by the shoulder, and his fingers snapped together like a lock. They were led downstairs. The lower passage led from the cutting hall straight to the water. A narrow staircase, wet walls. At the bottom, a single lantern burned, and a barge with low sides was moored there. Chiron counted the steps and thought. He couldn't give away someone else's gift. The verse spoke of two. He was the third. He was the scales, not the bowl. So two were needed. Obad was alone, so they had to wait. And then heels clacked above them. Yuna caught up with them halfway down the stairs. She said she'd seen a crack and that the glass hadn't shattered once in 40 years, and that she wouldn't go anywhere until she understood what had happened. Obad told her to leave. He said he was 16 and had one drowned man and that he didn't want a second. He held Chiron with one hand and reached for her with the other. And at that moment, Chiron saw them both at the same time. 12 and 21. The thread and the grip. He spoke the two true names aloud. Not the ones they were called at the orphanage, the ones that stood in the lines. He spoke them calmly and distinctly, like an appraiser reading an inventory. The brand on his forearm grew warm. The lantern flickered, and Obad's fingers unclenched. They simply unclenched on their own. He looked at his hand as if it were someone else's. He tried to clench his fist and couldn't. For 16 years, his gift had never failed him once. His face went blank and looked very old. Yuna grabbed Chiron by the collar and hoisted him up a step in a single motion, then recoiled in fear at what she had done. Chiron looked at his forearm. The second mark on the rocker was darkening right before his eyes. Slowly, like ink on wet paper. He tried to remember the name of the woman who had been his mother in his 31st life. He remembered her hands. He remembered the smell of resin in her hair. He remembered how she had died. There was no name. In place of the name was a hole. Yuna dragged him up the stairs, never letting go of his collar. The strength in her fingers wasn't her own, and she knew it. Chiron counted his heartbeats. At 40, he told her to let him go and run away on her own. She didn't let go. At 70, Obad screamed from below, not from pain, from fear. He was screaming that his arms were giving out. At 100, nothing had changed. Chiron waited for another 20 beats, and then another 30. Her grip hadn't returned. He was the first to realize it, and he understood what it meant better than anyone. The exchange hadn't reversed. The exchange had frozen solid. They didn't exit through the square, but through a coal chute near the water pump. Hauven was built on 3 levels, and its entire lower level thrived on what the upper level lost. Chiron led her through alleys that no orphanage child could remember. He remembered cities laid out this way from 6 other people's lives, and his feet chose the right turns on their own. Yuna asked what he'd done with Obad. He replied that he'd taken from him what he'd used against the children for 16 years and given it to someone who would use it to keep from drowning. She said it was theft. He said it was an exchange, and that she hadn't received a gift, but a job. She looked at her hands and said nothing. They hid in the drying room above the dye house, where steam rose from below, and no one could be seen from 2 steps away. Chiron sat down on the floorboards and began to examine what he now had. A brand, 10 divisions, 2 dark, 8 light, lines above people, true names, and a single phrase. Name 2 true names and swap the places of what is embedded within them. He checked the rules just as he had checked everything in his previous 100 lives, carefully and on someone else's skin. By evening, he knew 3 things. He had to see both of them at the same time, he had to say both true names aloud and without error, and the exchange lasts exactly 100 beats of his own heart, after which the gifts return to their places. That's how it was with the 2 porters at the water pump, who didn't notice anything except that one suddenly stopped hearing footsteps behind him while the other heard them. That's how it was with the 2 peddlers at the covered market. 100 beats, and everything returned to normal. So the exchange with Obad was an exception. That meant there was a condition the verse had kept silent about. Chiron didn't like conditions that were kept secret. He lay there, counting through 100 lives, and on the 99th, he realized he was counting 99. The 31st was gone. It hadn't been erased entirely. There was still resin in his hair and on his hands. Everything remained except for what makes a life someone's own. He lay a couple of steps away from the dye house and counted very quietly. 100 minus 1. 99 attempts. He didn't know for sure that the price was exactly that, but he knew what the bill looked like when it was presented. By morning, he decided that the first thing he'd do was pay off the old debt. Not because he wanted revenge. He'd had his fill of revenge in 40 lifetimes, and it had never paid off. He was after something else. Garvin Dahl didn't run the orphanage on a salary. He ran it on the difference. The guild paid 8 weights for every child written off. The book of written-off children listed 3 children per year. 9 were sent off on the barges. The difference was covered by a donation. The balance stood at 34 weights. Garvin didn't falsify the books. He kept 2 sets, and both balanced down to the last copper coin. He kept the second one entirely in his head and never wrote anything down. Not a single auditor in 11 years found a single error because there were no errors. Every other 10-day period, a reconciliation took place in the orphanage courtyard. A clerk from the Guild of Measurement named Rand would arrive with a box under his arm and sit down at the table. Garvin would dictate from memory. Rand wrote it down. It had been that way for 11 years. Rand was a dull, self-assured man. He told everyone at the Guild Tavern that the shelter on Dolgovaya Mera was the only place in Halvin where nothing needed to be checked. Chiron and Yuna came to the audit and stood in the crowd. There were 40 people in the courtyard, shelter residents and 2 guards. 3 women from the sewing workshop who had come looking for Yuna at her request but hadn't found her. Obad stood by the wall and didn't approach anyone. He held his left hand with his right. Garvin was dictating. Chiron spotted a dock worker in the crowd who had been standing there since early morning simply because he was waiting for the warehouse to open. Above him was the word back and the number 9. The gift was one of the cheapest. The man could carry loads twice as long as others and nothing more. Chiron named 2 real names, the dock workers and Garvin Dolls. The brand grew warm. Garvin got halfway through a line and stopped. He opened his mouth and closed it. He looked at his folder, and the folder suddenly became nothing more than a piece of paper with check marks. Rand looked up and waited. Garvin named a number. Then another. Then a third. Rand said that the first 2 didn't match the last audit by 14 weights. Garvin said he'd made a mistake. In 11 years, he'd never said those words once. Rand flipped the page back. Then back again. The dull, confident face of a man who hadn't checked anything in 11 years began to change. At first, he just frowned. Then he began counting aloud, lost his count, and started over. Then he set down his quill and asked very slowly how many children had gone out on the barges last year. Garvin replied that there were 3. Rand asked how many waybills had been signed by the Glass Guild. Garvin replied that there were 3. Rand took his copy out of the drawer and said he had 9. The courtyard fell silent. Chiron counted his heartbeats. 80. 90. At 100, his gift returned to Garvin, and Garvin remembered everything at once. That was the worst part. He remembered the entire second book and began to speak quickly and fluently, naming 20 numbers in a row, and they all added up. And that was exactly what killed him. Because a man who, just a minute ago, couldn't add 2 numbers together and was now rattling them off without a hitch, didn't look like an honest man who'd made a mistake. He looked like someone who had the second book memorized. Rand stood up. He told the guards to take the folder and the man. He said he was filing a petition with the Guild of Measures for a full audit covering the past 11 years. Garvin shouted that he'd been replaced, that this was someone else's scheme, and that someone had gotten inside his head. And then the first chill ran through the courtyard, because nothing like this had ever happened in the Kadron Empire. A gift could not be taken away. A gift could not be borrowed. The gift was the only constant in a world where everything else could be bought or burned. The people in the courtyard looked at one another, and not a single one voiced what they were all thinking. The women from the sewing workshop led Yuna away at his request. Chiron told her to go. She said she would return. He said he knew. Obad remained standing by the wall. When Chiron walked past, Obad caught his gaze and didn't look away. He said very quietly that for 16 years he'd had the children by the collar and had never once thought about what it felt like. He said that now he thought about it every hour. He didn't ask for it back. He asked only one thing. He asked if it would still hurt. Chiron said it would, and that the pain wasn't the main thing. Obad nodded and went into the shelter, and that very evening he tore the board with the numbers off the wall and burned it in the courtyard. By nightfall, Halvin was already talking. Not about Garvin, about something else. About how there was someone in the lower city who was taking the gifts. The rumor spread exactly as all rumors do. First in whispers, then with details that didn't exist. By the third day, people were saying it was an old woman. By the fifth, that it was a plague-stricken person. By the seventh, that it was a child with the mark of the scales on their arm. And in the hall of the cutter, Master Andrus Kale stood before the stone of measure and stared at the crack. He stood there for 3 nights in a row. The stone of measure in Halvin had been set at the city's foundation. In 400 years, it had never cracked once. Kale ordered the old ledgers to be brought up from the basement. Not the 10-year-old ones, the ones that lay in lead boxes and could only be opened with permission from the Curia of the Cutters Guild. He read them until morning. And on the 4th night, he found what he was looking for. 1 page, 1 line. The name of the class was crossed out with ink so thick that it had burned through the paper. Next to it, in the margins, was a note in an old hand. Only the Curia is permitted to read the line, "Deliver the bearer alive. The stone will crack twice." Kale sat down and stared at his very white hands for a very long time. Then he wrote 2 letters. The first to the Curia of the Gem Cutters in the capital. The second to the House of Ascar, who had kept Halvin on his payroll for 40 years. In both letters, he wrote the same thing. A boy who cannot be measured has appeared in the city. The letters were sent by the morning mail, but Chiron didn't find out about them until 11 days later, and those 11 days decided everything. He went down to Lower Haven and didn't come back up. The lower city lay beneath the bridges along the old riverbed and thrived on exactly what was unsuitable for the upper city. Here they repaired what the people above threw away. Here people worked with tin and dust. Here no one asked for a name because a name was worth more than food. Chiron went to Selma Var's mending shop because he needed a roof over his head and because the shop stood right by the water and had 2 exits. Selma Var was a herbalist. She was nearly 60 and possessed the gift of tin. Her gift was called bitterness and allowed her to distinguish real roots from fakes by taste. With this gift, she had supported herself and 8 neighborhood elders for 40 years. She looked at Chiron and said that she only fed boys without a gift in exchange for work, and that her work was dirty. He said he agreed. He scrubbed the cauldrons for 4 days and said nothing. On the 5th day, a man came to Selma from the other side of the riverbed. A bridge builder, a name Chiron read on him at once. He possessed copper. His gift was called stone and allowed him to sense a crack in the masonry before it gave way. With such a gift, a man could earn his keep for a lifetime. But the bridge builder hadn't come for work. He'd come to find poison for himself. The Bridge Builders Guild held a recertification exam once every 3 years, and the exam consisted of 2 tests, masonry and the climb. He had already failed the climbing test twice because of his bad back, and on his third failure, he would be expelled from the guild for good, and his 2 sons would be expelled along with him, because guild membership was inherited from the father. Selma said she wouldn't give him the poison. The bridge builder sat down on the threshold and began to cry. Chiron stepped out from behind the cauldrons and said that the bridge builder would pass the lifting test. Selma ordered him to be quiet. He didn't stop talking. He asked the bridge builder if he had a friend with a strong back and a weak mind who was willing to stand by his side for half an hour. A friend was found. The test took place in the guild courtyard under the watch of 3 assessors. Chiron stood in the crowd, keeping both of them in his sight. He named 2 true names. The bridge builder lifted a log he had never lifted in his life and was the most surprised of all. On the 87th heartbeat, the trial ended. On the 100th, the gifts returned to their places, and no one noticed a thing. Selma Var saw everything from the corner of the courtyard. She had come home before him and was waiting in the doorway. For 40 years, she had distinguished the real from the fake by taste, and for 40 years, she had known that in this world, a person is worth only what was bestowed upon them at birth, and there's nothing that can be done about it. She looked at the boy who had been washing her pots for 4 days, and her face changed slowly and with difficulty, just as an old tree changes. She asked once, "Was he the one, or wasn't he?" He said he was. She sat down on the step and said that her whole life she'd considered herself a person who understood how things worked. Then she set a condition. She said she would give him a corner, bread, and her name before the neighborhood. In return, he would not lay a hand on a single person without that person's consent. Not once. Not for the sake of a good cause. Not to save his own skin. Chiron agreed, and at that moment, he didn't lie. What followed were 11 days that Halvin would remember for a long time. The mending shop operated as usual during the day and ran differently after sunset. The first to arrive was the carver, who had been kept tied up with ropes at the port because the bone workshop didn't take outsiders. Chiron swapped his gift with the baker's son for an hour, and the carver passed the guild's trial and was accepted. The second to arrive was a water carrier carrying ashes. There was nothing Chiron could do to help him, so Chiron told him so directly and took nothing from him. The water carrier left and told the whole neighborhood about it, which led to more than 10 successful exchanges. The third to arrive was a woman whose sister was dying. She asked to give her sister her gift as a herbalist forever. Chiron explained the condition. He said that a permanent exchange does not happen by his will. He said that the scales decide on their own and that he does not know how. The woman agreed anyway, and the exchange took effect after 100 heartbeats. She wept but thanked him all the same. The fourth person to arrive was a man who smelled of the upper city and who asked to swap his nephew's gift for that of a stranger's boy without the boy's knowledge, offering 12 gold pieces. Selma swept him out the door with a broom. Chiron stared at the closed door longer than he should have. By the 9th day, people in the neighborhood were already calling it the Fate Mender. By the 11th, a line had been forming at the doorstep since the night before. Chiron didn't take money from them. He took a rule. In exchange, people brought not payment, but a service, and they brought the service not to him, but to the next person in line. He had seen this system in his 72nd life, in a city where there were no coins, and he knew that it would last only as long as the fear of the one at the center endured. In 11 days, he made 19 temporary exchanges and 1 eternal one. The eternal one happened on the 8th day, and it happened of its own accord. 2 brothers arrived. The older one had silver and a gift for the sword, which he could not use because his wrist had been broken as a child. The younger one had tin and a gift for arithmetic. He sat in the shop and hated the shop. They came together and asked together, Chiron called out their names. The exchange stood firm and did not falter, neither after 100 blows nor after 1,000. The third division on the brand had darkened, and that very night he lost his 52nd life. He remembered that he had been a blacksmith there. He remembered the heat and the anvil. He did not remember whose son he had been there. Chiron sat down on the floorboards and wrote the number 98 on the board with charcoal. Then he erased it. Then he wrote it again. He thought all night, and by dawn he had pieced together the rule in its entirety. The scales would hold forever only that exchange where both gifts were out of place. Not the one that was profitable, not the one that was kind, the one that was true. A grip on a man who didn't want to hold anyone, and a thread on a girl who had nothing to hold on to. A blade in the shop and a debt in the barracks. Fate itself acknowledged the mistake, corrected it through his hands, and exacted a price from him for it. He didn't choose. He was an instrument of his own power, and he hadn't liked it in any of his 100 lives. Rumors reached the upper city sooner than he'd expected. Yuna was the first to arrive. She'd been taken into the sewing workshop on request, and now her fingers wouldn't unclench. The master seamstresses said they'd never seen such a grip before. She brought bread and news. Posters had been put up throughout the upper city. A 15-year-old boy, a foot of ashes, a distinctive mark, a brand on the right forearm. A reward of 40 gold weights for him alive. No payment for the dead. The second piece of news was about Drest. He'd left the orphanage after an inspection by the Guild of Measure and had lived by the river for 1.5 10-day periods, and one day he got in line at the mending shop. Chiron came out to meet him personally. Drest said he wanted gold. He said he didn't care whose it was. He said he'd seen Chiron do it and was willing to wait as long as it took. Chiron replied that no one would give him gold because the scales don't take desire into account. The line grew longer because the review of recruits meant conscription. The House of Askar took one man from every 200 households into its militia and accepted only those of the silver rank and higher. Everyone else went into the supply companies, which in the Cadran Empire were called first-line companies because they were placed at the front to absorb enemy arrows. 3 days before the review, 40 men came to the mending shop, and each asked for the same thing. Each asked to borrow another silver for 1 hour. Chiron refused all 40 and said one thing that was then repeated throughout the neighborhood for the entire year. He said that if he placed a man in a squad with someone else's gift, within 100 heartbeats, that man would remain in the ranks without the gift and with another's fate on his shoulders. He said that a gift could be borrowed, but death could not. Selma listened from behind the cauldrons and, for the first time in 11 days, looked at him without fear. The review was taking place on the open field beyond the upper wall. 3 platforms, a measuring stand, 100 tents. The Guild of Measurement had set up its table, and Master Andres Kale sat at the table, reading the ranks to the recruits with his smooth white hand. Velt Askarn sat on the middle platform, bored. He was 22. His gift was called the Blade of Dawn, and he was the 3rd ranked in the house and the 2nd ranked in the province. He had won 6 guild duels and not a single real battle. He had come to the review because his father had ordered him to show himself to the people, and he showed himself the way those who have never had to prove anything do. He spent the first morning calling out recruits one by one and knocking them down with his blunt blade in 3 strikes. The crowd cheered. He did this 9 times. On the 10th turn, a bridge builder came out, one whom Chiron had helped pass the physical, and Velt knocked him down with his very first move, broke his forearm, and told the organizer to record it as an accident at the tryouts. Chiron stood in the crowd with Yuna and Obad. Obad had come on his own. He now lived at the sewing workshop where he sewed, and said his hands turned out to be better than his head. He looked at the platform and held his left hand with his right out of old habit. Yuna said one word. She said, "Enough." Selma took Chiron by the sleeve and reminded him of the condition: not a single person without consent. Chiron said he remembered. He looked at the platform and counted. Over 13 years across 40 lives, he had learned one thing about people like Velt Askarna. You can't defeat someone like that by force, because force is his right. You can't kill someone like that because the house will come for him. You can only make someone like that look ridiculous. And then, no one will come for him. On the third day of the review, there was a grand circle. That was the name given to the exhibition match between the best recruit and a man from the house. The circle took place in front of the entire gathering and before the table of the Guild of Measure. Velt stepped into the circle under his banner. Opposite him stood a young man with silver from the river villages. The field kitchen stood 30 paces from the circle. There, a woman named Tessa had been working since 4 in the morning. She had been feeding the review for the 3rd year in a row. Above her hung the word hearth and the number 7. Her gift was one of the smallest. It allowed her to sense when it was time to take the pot off the fire. It gave her nothing else, and her whole life she stood in the smoke, and her whole life she was called the wagon train woman. Chiron approached the kitchen and asked her for permission. He asked directly and put it all in his own words. He said he would take the hearth from her for 100 heartbeats, and that in exchange for those 100 heartbeats, she would hold the province's heaviest gift in her hands, and that afterward, people might come looking for her. Tessa wiped her hands on her apron and asked him if this would do any good. He said it would. She agreed. He didn't touch her without asking, and that saved him a great deal later on. Velt Askarn raised his blade. Chiron spoke the 2 true names. He spoke them softly, and no one around heard anything but the crowd's roar. The brand grew warm, and Velt Askarn stepped forward and missed the man standing there. He missed just as someone who had never held a weapon before would miss. The crowd laughed. He struck again, and the blade veered off course, and he himself nearly stumbled. The river boys stepped back and didn't strike, because hitting the air to the house meant a whipping. Velt shouted that it was a sham. He glanced back at the platform and the table of the Guild of Measure. And then something happened that Chiron hadn't planned for, and that decided everything. Out of habit, Velt reached for what had been within him since birth, and it responded. Only it responded to the wrong thing. He was standing in the middle of the circle in front of 2,000 people when he suddenly sensed with absolute clarity that the water in the cauldron by the wagon kitchen was boiling over, and that the meat needed to be removed immediately. He turned his head toward the kitchen. He couldn't help himself. The gift led him like a leash. He walked across the entire circle amid the laughter of 2,000 people, took the cauldron off the fire, and only then realized what he had done. The laughter in the clearing did not die down immediately, and in the silence that followed, it was very clearly audible how Tessa, standing by the kitchen, was holding a ladle in her hands, and how that ladle was splitting an oak log for the meat in 2. She did it by accident. She simply let her hand drop. At the table of the Guild of Measure, Master Andres Kale rose very slowly. He wasn't looking at Velt. He was looking into the crowd, searching with his eyes, and for the first time in his life, Chiron felt that his thoughts were being read in return. On the 97th strike, Chiron began leading his men into the alley between the tents. On the 100th strike, the exchange was not asleep. Chiron sensed this through the chill in his forearm before his mind could comprehend it. The 4th division on the brand had darkened. The scales recognized the exchange as valid. The blade of dawn remained in the hands of the woman who had stood in the smoke for 30 years. And the 3rd heaviest gift of House Askarn became a hearth with a weight of 7 and remained so forever. That night, Chiron lost his 89th life. He remembered the snow and the horses there, but he did not remember a single face. 97. A sergeant of the House of Asgar named Maris Tane led Velt away from the pasture under his cloak. Maris had served the house for 20 years. For 8 of those, he had followed the young master. And for 8 years, he had told everyone in the barracks that the gift was order, and that order never fails. That evening, he sat in the tent and watched the man who had been the province's third-ranked swordsman, and who was now weeping and begging for the reading to be repeated. Maris Tane stepped out of the tent and stood beneath the cold sky. Then he ordered his men not to harm the camp cook and to lead her out of the camp alive. He hadn't been ordered to do this. He'd done it on his own, and he didn't understand why. By morning, Halvin was no longer whispering. Halvin was speaking aloud. They said that in the lower city sat a man who could take away from the Lord everything that made him a lord. For the first time in 40 years, the lower city had stopped fearing the upper city, and that turned out to be worse than any bounty on a head. It wasn't 40 people who came to the mending shop. 300 came. They stood in silence and asked for no exchanges. They simply stood there, staring at the door and waiting for something. Selmavar looked at them and told Chiron that he was no longer a boy who could be hidden away, and that now he was either a banner or a target, and that there was no third option in this empire. And 2 days later, a detachment descended on Lower Halvin. Not soldiers from the barracks, 12 men in gray with a white measure on their chests. The Measure Guild's investigators. They walked through the neighborhood, neither searching nor asking questions. They headed straight for the mending shop because they knew where to go. Drest led the way, his head bowed. Kyrina wasn't home at that hour. He returned at sunset. The door to the mending shop hung by a single hinge. The cauldrons had been overturned. Selmavar was gone. On the door was a sign burned into the wood, one that everyone in the Kadron Empire knew and that had not been seen in Halvin for 90 years. The open scales of the curia of the cutter. And beneath the sign, a note was nailed in place, written in a single line in very neat white handwriting. An exchange is offered. Come and trade. Chiron took the note off the nail and read it 3 times. Then he sat down on the threshold of the ransacked mending shop and stayed there until dark. And none of the 300 people standing in the alley approached him. He was counting. Not heartbeats. He was counting what he had. 97 lives. 6 bright divisions. 1 class that worked only for 2 people and never for him. And 1 old woman who took him off the street to scrub cauldrons and set 1 condition for him, one he'd already nearly broken twice. Yuna arrived around midnight and said that Selma wasn't being held in the city jail, but in the basement of the Hall of the Cutter, and that this meant she was being protected. Obad arrived toward morning and brought the most important news. He had sewn 5 cloaks overnight for the scribes of the Guild of Measure, and had overheard everything that was said in the front room. An investigator from the Curia of the Cutter was on her way from the capital to Halvin. Her name was Irma Holt. She was carrying a lead box with a seal and an order addressed to a single name. She was due to arrive in 2 10-day periods. Magister Andres Kale had no intention of waiting 2 10-day periods for her. Chiron understood everything immediately, and understood it correctly. Kale didn't want to catch him. Kale wanted him first, while the Curia was on the road, while the House of Asgar was licking its wounds, while there was no one in Halvin with more power than the smooth white hand at the table. Chiron stood up and said he was going. Yuna said it was a trap. He replied that of course it was a trap, and that he'd have to walk into it anyway because a man was being held for him, and because a man you don't go in for ceases to be the man you go after. He took 2 men with him. He took no one else. The cutting hall stood empty. No onlookers, no guild members, no guards in the square. The doors were wide open, and that alone spoke volumes. Inside, all the lamps were lit at once. The stone of measure stood on 4 supports, and a crack ran down it from top to bottom, just as before. Selma Var sat on a low stool by the wall, alive. Her hands were bound in front with rope, not iron. Master Andres Kale stood at the table, laying out sheets of paper as one does before a verification. 12 men in gray stood along both walls of the hall. Kale said he was glad he hadn't had to search for her. He said the boy was smarter than one might expect from a written-off number. Then he laid out his proposal, and he did so calmly that it was worse than a threat. He said he knew about the class. He said he'd found the crossed-out line, that it had been crossed out 400 years ago, and that until now he'd considered it a fairy tale for investigators. He said he had a gift, and that this gift weighed 51 and was called Measure, and that this was precisely why he read the stone rather than serve in the house. He said he wanted an exchange. He named the man who was brought up from the basement next, a young guild servant. Above him stood the word memory and the weight 62. Kale wanted that memory for himself. Kale explained why, and it was the quietest abomination Chiron had ever heard in 97 lifetimes. He said that a person with measure sees the value of everything, and a man with the measure and a memory remembers the price of everything and everyone and never forgets it. He said that then he wouldn't need the registers. He said that then he himself would become the register. In exchange, he would release the herbalist and write to the curia that the boy had died in custody. Chiron listened, but he wasn't looking at Kale. He was looking at the line above him. Not Andres, not Kale. Above the assessor of the Guild of Measure stood another name, and Chiron read it for the 4th time in his life. And on the 4th time, he finally understood why it seemed familiar. He asked one thing aloud. He asked how many years ago the real Andres Kale had died. The hall fell very quiet. The 12 men in gray didn't move because they didn't understand. Selma Var raised her head, and the very straight back behind the table bent slightly for the first time in her life. Chiron continued speaking, calmly, as if an appraiser were reading an inventory. He said that a gift cannot be taken or stolen, and that the entire empire knows this. He said that, however, a name could be taken. He said that 41 years ago, in the Guild of Measure's registry, a man with the gift of measure and a weight of 51 had been appointed to Halvin, and that this man had died on the way, and that the man who arrived in his place 41 years ago had read others' steps under a false name and written off into dust those who were to be written off. He said he didn't know how it had been arranged. He said he knew only the true name, and he spoke it aloud. Kale didn't scream. Kale very slowly set down his quill. One of the 12 gray figures by the wall stepped forward, paused, and looked at his master, and saw no denial on his face. That was enough. Chiron managed to do exactly one thing. He named 2 true names, Kale's and the servants. He swapped their gifts, not for himself. He did it so that the man with a measure of 100 heartbeats would become a man with someone else's memory and see his own 41 years from the inside without a single gap. Kale fell to his knees by the table and covered his face with his hands. He remained silent for the first 20 heartbeats, and then he began to speak and spoke without stopping, naming numbers and names and years. And within those numbers were children from the barges and the written-off steps and 8 scales for each one, and all of this was heard by the 12 members of the Guild of Measure and the bound old woman by the wall. On the 100th blow, the offerings returned to their places. The scales did not recognize the exchange as valid. Measure was in her place. She had always been in her place. That was the whole horror of it. Chiron managed to cut the rope binding Selma Var's hands, and they managed to reach the doors. A detachment stood in the doorway, not the gray ones, blue cloaks with a white measure. At the front stood Sergeant Maris Tane, followed by 40 mounted men from the House of Askar, now dismounted and in full armor. And between the columns on the square stood a stretcher with a drawn canopy, and next to it a woman in a traveling cloak with a lead box slung from her belt. Elena Holt had arrived in Halvin less than 2 10-day periods ago. She arrived 9 days early because she had set out not from the capital, but from the Ortanis garrison, and because Magistrate Kale's letter was not the first to mention the cracked stone. She entered the hall and looked neither at Kale nor at the Greys. She looked at the boy and said one word. She said, "Show me." Chiron rolled up his right sleeve. The mark of the scales. 10 divisions, 4 dark ones. Irma Holt set the box on the table, unlocked it with the key around her neck, and took out a sheet of paper that was older than anyone standing in that hall. She read aloud, her voice steady. The class of the Judge of Judgments was added to the list of prohibited classes at the founding of the Cadran Empire. The bearer is to be delivered to Ortanis alive and unharmed. The bearer must not be tried in the province. The bearer must not be interrogated. The bearer's name must not be spoken aloud. The last known bearer was executed 411 years ago by personal order of the founder, and his name was erased from all the empire's records. She finished reading, turned the page, and held it up for the hall to see. On the reverse side was a single line, not erased, but burned into the paper, and next to it was an old note stating that it could only be read in the presence of the Curia. And Irma Holt read that line aloud because the Curia was here, and she herself was the Curia. She spoke the erased name, and Chiron heard his own name from his 47th life, the one where he was led to his execution and counted his steps, the one where, until the very last step, he did not understand why. The convoy left Halvin at dawn, and within the very first verse, Chiron realized he wasn't being transported as a prisoner. Prisoners are transported in chains. He was being transported in a covered wagon with 2 bars and no chains, and flying above the wagon was the leaden flag of the Curia of Ogarka, which signified that the contents could neither be inspected nor contested. Irma Holt rode ahead. Maris Tane led 40 horsemen from the House of Askar. 12 Greys walked on either side on foot. No one was to call him by name during the 19-day journey, and by the second hour they were already referring to him as cargo. It's simpler that way. It's safer that way. That's what they call something that isn't human. Chiron sat at the bottom of the wagon and counted. 97 lives, 4 dark divisions, 6 light ones, and 1 new piece of knowledge that burned more intensely than the brand. 411 years ago, he had already been transported alive along the very same road. He lay down on the planks and pulled the 47th life out of his memory in its entirety. He pulled it out piece by piece, like removing a splinter. He had been a tax collector there in a coastal town. He knew how to read people. He knew the same things he knew now. He remembered the first time he exchanged gifts with 2 fishermen and how they both laughed. He remembered how, a year later, he was welcomed at court as a rarity. He remembered how, another year later, they stopped calling him by his name and began calling him a tool. And he remembered the staircase. 12 steps. He'd counted them back then and didn't understand why. Now he understood. He wasn't executed for what he'd done. He was executed for what he was capable of doing. Irma Holt came to the wagon every evening. She would sit on the running board, spread a sheet of paper on her lap, and ask questions she had no right to ask, according to her own orders. She said she wasn't interrogating him, but verifying. She was in her late 30s, an investigator for the 3rd Circle of the Curia of the Grinding. Above her name stood the word witness and the number 29. Her gift allowed her to know when the person across from her was certain of their words and when they were not. It didn't distinguish truth from lies, it distinguished certainty from pretense. With this gift, she had traveled through the provinces for 14 years, taking statements, and had never once been wrong about whether a person was trustworthy. Chiron answered her honestly about almost everything. He didn't do it out of kindness. He did it because she could read his confidence, and any lie would have cost him more than the truth. She asked how many exchanges he had made. He said 23. She asked how many of them had remained permanently. He said 4. She asked what he paid with. He said he didn't know. She looked at him longer than usual and noted that the suspect was unsure on this point and that this was the first point on which he was unsure. He hadn't lied. He really didn't know the name of what he was losing. He knew only the count. On the third day, the convoy entered the ridge. That was the name given to the 80 versts of low, wooded hills between Halvin and the road to Ortanis. The road there ran along the bottom of a gully, flanked on both sides by alder groves. Maris Tane had sent 4 scouts ahead that morning, and 3 had returned. He hadn't told anyone about the 4th except Irma Holt. By noon, he ordered his men to put on their helmets, and from the wagon, Chiron saw 40 men silently carrying out an order they didn't understand. Olvin Rhett was walking beside the railing, a young gray, 18 years old, in his 2nd year of training. Above him stood the word step and the weight 11. His gift gave him endurance during the transition and nothing else. All the way, Olwyn spoke not to Chiron, but beside him, repeating the same thing over and over. He said that the list of forbidden classes had been compiled by the founder, that the founder could not be wrong, and that if a class was forbidden, it contained poison, even if the bearer was a good person. He repeated this on the 2nd day, the 3rd, and the 4th. Chiron listened and did not argue. In his 70 lifetimes, he had learned that you cannot out-argue a person on what they have believed since the age of 18. You can only place them where faith ceases to hold sway. The pass was blocked on the 4th day at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. 2 freshly felled tree trunks lay across the gully. Riders came down from the hill behind them. There were about 60 of them, and they rode without a banner, which was worse than a banner. People without a banner are not bound to answer for what they've done. Maris Tane turned the ranks around and said aloud what everyone already understood. He said that this was his own home. He said he recognized the horses. The house of Asgarn could not allow the boy to be taken alive to Ortanis. A living boy meant an interrogation. An interrogation meant a report. A report meant that the entire empire would read how the province's 3rd blade had taken the cauldron off the fire in the middle of the review. But his house did not want to kill him either. The house needed to recover the Blade of Dawn, and it could only be recovered by the hands of the one who had taken it. That's why the first volley wasn't aimed at the wagon. The first volley was aimed at the convoy's horses. After that, things happened quickly. Chiron watched the battle through the bars and saw it as people who've lived 100 lives see it. No heroes, no heroic feat. He saw where the formation would break in a minute. Maris Tane held the center, and he held it well. He had copper, and his gift was called stance, which allowed him to maintain his balance no matter the blow. For 20 years, that had been enough. This time, it wasn't. A man with gold came down the hill. Above him stood the word battering ram and the weight 55. He walked on foot and, with his very first move, knocked down 3 men. He was heading for the wagon, and he didn't care who stood between him and it. Olvin Rhett stood by the grill and didn't step aside. He had 11 against 55. He didn't step back because the list of prohibited classes had been drawn up by the founder, and because the cargo had to be delivered alive and unharmed. Chiron looked at him and saw that the boy was about to die for an entry in the registry. And then he tried something he'd never tried before. He needed 2 people. There were none. There was 1 man with a battering ram and 1 boy with a step, and switching places would have been useless because after 100 blows, everything would have returned to normal and the battering ram would have killed Olvin on the second pass. Chiron placed his palm on the brand and called out only 1 true name, the name of the man with the battering ram. He called his name and did not call the second. The brand didn't grow warm. The brand burned. The pain shot up his arm to his shoulder and rose into his throat, and at that moment, Chiron felt a weight. A real weight, as if 55 stones had landed on his shoulders all at once. The man on the road took a step and suddenly became ordinary. He struck, and the blow came out human. Olvin Rhett stood his ground, though he didn't understand how, and Chiron sat at the bottom of the wagon, holding someone else's gift inside him, unable to use it. Not for a finger's breadth, not for a single blow. The gift lay within him like a foreign cargo in a foreign hold. The scales took it into their custody. He grasped the rule in its entirety in 3 breaths. He could extract a gift from a person and hold it within himself. He could not put it on. He was not a chalice, but a rocker arm. He was a warehouse. He could later place this gift into anyone. The fight ended 20 blows after the battering ram ceased to be a battering ram. The men without a banner realized that something had broken and didn't bother to figure out exactly what. They retreated into the alder grove, taking 16 horses with them. 9 dead remained on the road, 7 from the convoy. Maris Tane stood over his squad leader, and for a very long time couldn't bring himself to take his hand off the man's shoulder. Irma Holt approached the wagon and looked at Chiron, and he could see that she was comparing his face to her gift, and that the gift was telling her one thing. The boy was certain of what he had done. She asked what he had done. He told the truth. He said that he had taken the gift and was keeping it within himself, and that he could return it to its owner right now or perhaps in a year. The convoy covered 210 versts in 11 days, and for all 11 days, Chiron worked with Irma Holt. He worked exactly like that. He didn't make excuses or haggle. He told her what he knew and watched to see what she would do with that knowledge. He had seen this in 96 lifetimes. A person in power who is given accurate information sooner or later begins to depend on it. She brought sheets of paper, and he told her the ranks of those they encountered along the way. She checked them against their travel documents. He was wrong twice out of 117 times, and both times it was because the person was traveling on someone else's travel document. She wrote that down too. On the 8th day, she brought not a sheet, but a box, that very same lead one. She said there were 3 items inside and that he had already seen the first 2, the order and the scorched line. She took out the 3rd and placed it on the boards, a dark metal ring 2 fingers wide. Inside, a series of small marks ran all the way around the circumference. Chiron looked at it and realized he couldn't read the line above Irma Holt while the ring was open. The line faded. He saw the woman and saw nothing but the woman. She called it a measuring collar and said there were 11 of them in the empire, that all 11 were kept by the Curia and that they had been made 411 years ago, all in the same year and for a single purpose. She closed the box and the line reappeared. She said she was transporting the collar on orders, that she would put it on as she approached the capital, and that she was telling him this in advance because she didn't want him to find out about it suddenly. Chiron asked why she was doing this. She replied that she didn't like surprises. He looked at her, and for the first time in 11 days, he couldn't fathom her completely, and that was rare. On the 9th day, he began to calculate. He calculated aloud and did so in her presence because he needed a witness with the gift of witnessing. He began with the stone of measure. The stone stood in every city. The stone read the step. In 400 years, it had never cracked anywhere, not even once, and it cracked right before his eyes. Irma confirmed it. He asked who made the stones. She said that stones warned made. She said that all the measure stones of the empire had been installed at its founding, that there were no new ones, and that in the 2 cities where the stones had split during a fire, the readings were conducted using a transcript from the capital. He asked how many bearers of the crown there had been over the past 400 years. She was silent for a long time, and then said 41. He asked how many of them had been born outside the great houses. She said not a single one. He asked in how many great houses the crown had been born twice in a row across generations. She took out a sheet of paper and calculated for half an hour, then said in 7. He asked her if she knew of even a single instance where the stone of measure had indicated ashes in the air of a great house. She said there were no such instances. He said that now she should listen to how it looked from his perspective. He said that a gift is something bestowed at birth, and that this bestowal does not depend on blood, and that in 96 lifetimes across 20 worlds, he had never seen a single place where an ability was passed down through the family name consistently and without fail for 400 years in a row. He said that doesn't happen. He said that if it did, then it wouldn't be birth. Then it must be destiny. He said that the stone of measure does not measure. The stone of measure grants. And then everything fell into place at once. Ashes were not a sentence to emptiness. Ashes were a denial of the grant. The 8 scales paid for the written-off child not as a prop for the ritual, but because within that child lay the unassigned. The Glass Guild was not a guild. Irma Holt listened, and her gift worked against her. She could see that the boy was certain. She sat on the footboard of the wagon, holding a sheet of paper on her lap, and hadn't written a single line in an hour. Then she said one thing quietly. She said that in the Curia there was a department she had never been allowed to enter, and that this department was called the Issuance Department, and that for 14 years she had thought that was the old name for the archives. On the 10th day, the convoy stopped in the Ortanis suburbs, and for the first time in 11 days, Chiron saw the capital. Ortanis lay in a bend of the river and was entirely white. A measuring post stood at every intersection. Each post was engraved with a measurement. A coat of arms hung above the gate, the very same coat of arms that Chiron remembered from the 12th step of his 47th life, an open palm holding 4 weights. The House of Wallandar. The ruling house of the Cadran Empire for 411 consecutive years. Chiron looked at the coat of arms and put the last piece in place. The founder executed the Judge of Judgments. The founder set the stones of measure. The founder compiled the list of forbidden classes. The founder made 11 collars that extinguished the lines. One man did all this in a single year. And then, for 411 years, his house produced the crown more often than all the other houses of the empire combined. He asked Irma Holt how many times the crown had been born into the House of Wallander. She looked at the sheet and said 19 times out of 41. Chiron laughed for the first time on the entire journey, though his laughter was brief. He told her that she wasn't taking him to trial. He said the trial had taken place 411 years ago, and that back then, the founder had needed a verdict. He said that now, no verdict was needed. He said they were taking him because he was once again the only person in the empire capable of removing what had been issued. He said they weren't taking him as a criminal. They were taking him as the key. Irma Holt closed the sheet and said she needed to go out to the suburbs for an hour, and that she'd be back before dark. She didn't return before dark. She returned late at night, and she didn't return alone. Chiron heard a cart and heard two voices, and one of the voices was familiar to him. Rand, the scribe of the Guild of Measure from Halvin, the very same one who hadn't checked anything for 11 years and who was the first to spot the second book during the audit. He was sitting on the box, shivering, and clutching a leather tube under his cloak. Irma approached the grill and said that the clerk had come to Ortanis to submit a petition for a full audit of the shelter on Dolgovia Mera, that his petition had been accepted on the second day, and that on the third day he had been summoned to the issuance department. She said that they had spoken to him very politely at the issuance department. She said they had offered him a position in the capital with triple the salary, and that they had demanded only one thing of him: to withdraw the petition and rewrite 11 years' worth of Halvenian records from scratch. Rand did not withdraw it. Rand took the tube containing the copies and walked through the suburbs for 3 nights, searching for the third circle interrogator who had questioned him a month earlier, because apart from her, he knew no one in the capital. Irma Holt said that she now had 2 accounts, and both matched. And then Chiron asked the final question of that night. He asked Rand who had signed the summons to the issuance department. Rand took out the sheet and read it aloud. There was a single signature. The Curia of the Cut, First Circle, Keeper of the Register, Darius Wallander. Irma Holt very slowly sat down on the running board. She said that no one from the ruling house had held a position in the First Circle of the Curia for 40 years. She said that Darius Wallander was the emperor's younger brother. She said that he had died 11 years ago and that she herself had been present at the removal of his body. Chiron looked at the signature and remembered the hall of the cutter in Halvin. He remembered a very straight back and very white hands, and a man who had lived under a false name for 41 years, treading in someone else's footsteps. He said aloud what no one in this empire had ever said before him. He said that a gift cannot be stolen. He said that a name can be stolen, and that if a name can be stolen once, it can be stolen for 411 years in a row. The collar was put on at dawn at the north gate, and Irma Holt put it on herself, never taking her eyes off him. The lock clicked once. The world went out. It didn't grow dark. It literally went out. Nothing stood above the people. Nothing stood above Maris Tane. Nothing stood above Olvin Rhett. Chiron looked at the 40 people and saw 40 people, and this was the very vision he'd had exactly once in his 101st life, until he was 15. He didn't know he'd managed to get used to it. It turned out he'd managed it in a month. 55 units of someone else's weight remained inside him and gave no response. The pledge was in place and was locked away with him. Ortanis accepted the escort without a single question. The cart was led through 3 courtyards and did not enter a prison. It entered the court of measure of the Curia of the Cutter. White stone, covered galleries. In the center of the courtyard stood the stone of measure, twice as tall as the one in Halvin and without a single crack. Chirona was placed in a room with a window overlooking this stone. A bed, a table, 2 blankets, a door without a bolt on the outside. Food was brought in hot. Over the course of 96 lifetimes, he had been held in such rooms 3 times, and all 3 times it ended the same way. This is not how a suspect is held. This is how property is held. On the second day, someone came to see him. It wasn't Irma Holt. Irma Holt had been removed from the case the very moment the convoy drove through the gates, and he didn't find out about it until the fourth day. A man of about 50 in a gray uniform without insignia came in. He introduced himself as the custodian of the list and gave his name as Darius Wallandar, calmly and politely, and Chiron could read nothing in his expression. He sat down across from him and spoke for 2 hours, and during those 2 hours he never once made a threat. He said that the Khadran Empire had stood for 411 years, and that during all those years there had not been a single major war within its borders, and that it was the only state of its kind in the known world. He said that before the empire was founded, there had been 9 kingdoms on this land, and that they had been slaughtering one another for 200 years straight, and that they had fought not for land, but for status. He said that the founder had found a way to settle the question of who was superior once and for all. He said that if a stone determines a person's place, then a knife does not. He said that the price for this is known, and that the price is ashes. He named a number. He said that every year in the empire, about 4,000 people are reduced to dust, and that this is less than 1 in 200, and that over 411 years of peace, this is the cheapest price any single state has ever paid. He said that the boy is 15 years old, that the boy has lived 100 lives, and that a person who has lived 100 lives must understand arithmetic. Chiron listened and grasped the most unpleasant truth. He realized that the man before him was no scoundrel. Before him stood a man who had weighed everything, arrived at an answer, and had lived with that answer for 400 years. Only then did the keeper of the list get down to business. He said that he was offering not a deal, but a job. He said that there were 4 great houses in the empire, and that for the past 40 years, 2 of them had been vying for the right to the first vote, and that if this continued for another 10 years, the empire would revert to 9 kingdoms. He said that there was a man who held the eastern passes, and that this man possessed a gift weighing 74, and that this gift must be removed and placed within another. He said that in return, he would release the herbalist Selma Var from the cellar of the Hall of Cutting in Halvin alive, and that he would sign this in the presence of witnesses. Chiron refused. He refused for 4 days. On the 5th day, they brought him not food, but a letter. The letter was brief. The Glass Guild had submitted a petition to the Curia requesting the write-off of a debtor named Selma Var, 71 years old, of the tin rank. The reason for the write-off was the debt measure shelter's debt for 11 years of maintaining unwritten-off children. The amount of the debt was 192 weights, shipment in 6 days. Chiron read the letter, holding it flat and careful not to crumple it. In his 40 lifetimes, he had seen what a lever looked like. A lever always looks like a piece of paper. On the 6th day, they led him out into the courtyard and brought him before a man in traveling clothes, an Eastern lord, the very one. He was told that the inquiry required a second reading, and he laughed and walked toward the stone of measure on his own. The keeper of the list stood in the gallery. He raised his hand, and the collar was removed from Chiron for 1 hour. Peace returned. Lines appeared above everyone, and the first thing Chiron saw was the line above the keeper of the list. Not Darius, not Valendar, and the weight, 88. The gift was named with a single word that Chiron had never encountered in any of the 20 worlds: inheritance. He stared at that word for exactly 2 breaths, and in those 2 breaths, he understood 411 years of the history of the Khadran Empire. Then he did what was required of him. He took the gift weighing 74 from the Eastern Lord and placed it into the person he was told to. He named 2 true names, and the scales accepted the exchange. And the exchange became permanent because the scales recognized him as faithful, and that was the worst part of all. The 6th Division turned black. Chiron lost his 22nd life that very night. He remembered the water and the sail there, but he didn't remember a single person with whom he had sailed for 11 years. 95. The collar was put back on an hour later. The keeper of the register signed the document revoking the Glass Guild's petition in the presence of 2 witnesses and handed a copy to Chiron, and this was followed to the letter. And on the 8th day, Olvin Rhett arrived. The young, gray-haired man stood in the doorway, unable to begin, and started in the middle. He said that the withdrawal document had been sent to Halvin by the evening mail. He said that the Glass Guild's barge had left Halvin 2 days ahead of schedule. He said there were 26 people on the barge, and that the passenger lists had been finalized even before the petition was submitted. He said the letter arrived in town when the dock was empty. Chiron sat on the bed and said nothing for a very long time. He went over the events of 6 days ago, and 7, and 8, and realized that he'd been outmaneuvered not by an hour's notice, but a week earlier. They'd let him bargain for something that was already gone. He'd paid with his life for an exchange that had strengthened those who'd orchestrated it. He'd thought he was buying an old woman. He'd bought himself proof of his own worth. Olvin Rhett said his final words, staring at the floor as he spoke. He said he'd submitted his report 3 times, that the 3rd report hadn't been accepted, and that he'd been ordered to hand over the gray one and leave for the garrison at the eastern passes. He said he was leaving in the morning. He said he'd believed in the list for 2 years, that he no longer believed in it, and that it had turned out to be worse than he'd thought because, instead of the list, he'd ended up with nothing. He left. Chiron stood up and walked over to the window. In the courtyard stood the stone of measure, twice as tall as the Haven stone. A white stone, not a single crack. And across the entire height of the white stone, a thin line was slowly moving from top to bottom. It had been moving for 2 days now, and no one had noticed it except him. The stone will crack twice. Olvin Rhett left for the eastern passes that morning, and that same evening, 2 people from Haven were brought to Myrni Devor. Chiron knew this by the sound. For 2 months, he had heard nothing in the courtyard but the footsteps of the guards and the sound of wheels, and suddenly he heard a woman's voice he recognized. He went to the window and saw Una Pell and Obad being led across the courtyard. Una walked straight ahead. Obad walked behind her, holding her left hand with his right. They were led into the gallery across the way, and Chiron spent the whole night staring at the closed door. In the morning, the keeper of the register came again and was just as polite. He said that the investigation in Haven was complete, that 4 people were being tried in connection with the case of the orphanage on Dolgovaya Mera, and that 2 of them had harbored a bearer of a forbidden class. He said that a 15-year-old seamstress had received the gift of grasping without reading and was unregistered, and that this in itself constituted an offense. He said that the former orphanage caretaker had lost his gift and failed to file a report, and that this, too, constituted an offense. He did not threaten them. He simply stated the facts. Then he explained why he had come. He said that in 11 days, the Great Reckoning would take place in Ortanis. Once every 4 years, all 4 great houses gather at the measured court and confirm the weight of their heirs at the capital stone. He said that the House of Ascar would arrive with their younger son instead of the elder, and that everyone in the empire knew why and would ask no questions. He said that at the verification, work would be required of Chiron. Not just one, a list. He placed the sheet on the table. 9 names, 9 weights. Opposite each name was an arrow and a second name. Chiron read the list and saw not names. He saw a map of the empire 20 years into the future. 3 houses were growing stronger. 1 was ceasing to exist as a house. He asked how many of the 9 exchanges were meant to become permanent. The keeper of the list said, "All 9, and said it without expression. Chiron said he didn't decide which exchange would last forever, that the scales decided, and that they recognized only what was right. The keeper of the list smiled for the first time in all their meetings. He said that the boy still hadn't grasped the main point. He said that what is right is not necessarily good. He said that what is right is what belongs in its proper place according to the order of the world. He said that the order of the world in the Khadran Empire was established 411 years ago and inscribed in stone, and that the scales read precisely that inscription. He said that all this time, the boy had thought he was the one passing judgment. He said that the stone passes judgment, and the boy is merely its hand. Chiron was silent. He was silent because at that moment he recalled his 4 consecutive eternal exchanges, and in each of them the scales had agreed with him. A grip for the guard who didn't want to hold anyone, a blade for the shop, a hearth for the heir, and one political exchange he'd made under blackmail, which the scales had accepted just as readily as the first 3. He'd always believed the scales were on his side. He'd never tested the opposite. On the 3rd day, he was allowed to see Yuna, half an hour, with 2 gray men present. She sat down across from him and, first of all, told him not to dare bargain on their behalf. She said she'd already seen how he bargained and what had come of it in Haven. She told him briefly and to the point. The mending shop was burned down 4 days after the convoy was taken away. The 300 people who had been standing in the alley didn't disperse right away, and 17 of them didn't disperse at all. They were arrested. The bridge builder and his 2 sons left the city and headed north. The carver from the port stayed behind and continues to work in the bone workshop. Tessa and the Dawnblade are alive, and she is being hidden in a caravan by a man whom Chiron does not know. Yuna does not know his name and knows only that he is a sergeant at the house of Ascar. Drest received 40 gold weights for his tip-off and is serving in Haven with the Guild of Measure, and he wears a new cloak. She said this last part calmly. She said that Selma Var had been seen on a barge, and that the Glass Guild's barges were being unloaded at the glass pits, 2 days' journey south of Ortanis, and that the ruse for the ceremony would be maintained until the 3rd ceremony. She said that if Selma had left on the 1st barge, then the 1st ceremony had already taken place. Chiron asked why she was telling him this. Yuna said that he was the only one in this empire who knew how to calculate the timing, and that if she didn't tell him, no one else would. The half hour was up. They took her away. Obata wasn't allowed to see him even once. On the 5th day, Chiron asked for paper and a pen and wrote a letter. It was the first thing he'd done of his own volition in a month. He didn't write to the keeper of the list. He wrote to Irma Holt. He didn't know where she was, nor did he know if she had been removed from her post entirely. He passed the letter to the woman who brought his food and didn't pay her anything because he had nothing to pay with. He simply asked her. In his 95 lifetimes, he had learned that this worked about 1 time out of 20. The letter contained 4 lines. He wrote that no one could see the 2nd crack in the capital stone. He wrote that he was asking her to come and see for herself. He wrote that if she saw the crack, it meant the list of forbidden classes did not protect the empire, but concealed its very structure. He wrote that if she did not see it, she should forget the letter. There was no reply for 4 days. On the 9th day before the great verification, they led him out into the courtyard without a collar, escorted by 12 guards. The keeper of the list wanted to check the work in advance. A man holding tin stood on the stone of measure. Next to him stood a man holding copper. Chiron was ordered to switch their places and was told not to explain anything. He looked at them and didn't move. And then the keeper of the register said very calmly that a 15-year-old seamstress was currently standing in the gallery, that she possessed a gift not listed in the register, that a gift not listed in the register was subject to confiscation by law, and that it would not be confiscated gently. Chiron looked into the gallery. Yuna stood between the two gray figures. She saw him and nodded once. He named the two true names. Tin and copper switched places. The exchange was complete after 100 beats. The scales did not recognize him as true. And that was the hardest minute of his 95 lives, because in that minute, he did not lose a single division and did not lose a single life, and yet he realized he had paid more than in Halvin. He submitted. He submitted during a trial exchange that meant absolutely nothing. The collar was put back on. At night, he lay there, counting in the dark. 95 lives, 6 dark divisions, 4 light ones, 1 pledge weighing 55 locked up with him, 9 exchanges in 9 days, 2 of his own in the gallery across the way, an old woman in the glass pits who'd already undergone her first rite. Not a single person in this city on his side. He lay there and, for the first time in 101 lives, thought not about how to win, but about how much longer he could endure losing. Toward morning, there were 2 knocks on the door, but no one came in. A sheet of paper folded in 4 was slipped under the door. Chiron unfolded it by the light streaming in from the window. 1 line, written in very steady handwriting. I've been seeing the crack for 2 weeks now. And below it, a second line. The distribution department keeps lists not only for the ashes, it keeps lists for the crown. Chiron burned the note over a candle, and from that moment on began counting not his losses, but the time remaining. 11 days became 9. He asked the guard for a second blanket, requested that his meals be brought twice a day, and asked for permission to walk along the gallery for an hour a day for the sake of his health. And they granted him all of this, because prisoners are required to keep their belongings in order. In 3 days, he had memorized the measured courtyard, just as he had memorized cities in 20 other lives. 8 gates. 4 of them are locked at night. The guards change shifts at the 3rd hour and the 9th. The stone courtyard is closed only during the verification and only for the duration of the reading. The kitchen is open from 4 in the morning, and supply wagons enter through the lower gate without inspection, because inspecting supply wagons inside the curia is considered an insult to the curia. He memorized this and wrote nothing down. On the 4th day, he began to speak. He spoke to everyone who entered the room and talked about trivial matters, about the weather, about the price of salt, about how the bread in Ortanis was bad. He had done this for 95 lifetimes and knew that a person who brings food to someone who has been silent for 40 days in a row will speak on the 41st day themselves. The woman from the kitchen was named Madrin. She had been bringing food for 8 years. She had a tin and 3 children, and the oldest of them had graduated last fall. Chiron asked what degree the oldest had received. Madrin replied that it was ashes, that the boy had been taken away that very day, that she'd been told he was serving at the Glass Guild's warehouse, and that she hadn't received a letter from him in 9 months. She said this calmly and without tears because she'd told the story 8 times, and all 8 times she'd been told that this is how it goes. Chiron didn't promise her anything. He said only one thing. He said that the barges were unloaded at the glass pits, that the stands were kept until the 3rd ceremony, and that the ceremonies took place once every 3 months. Madrin sat down on a stool and stayed there until the food had cooled. She arrived an hour early the next day. On the 5th day, Irma Holt arrived. She was allowed in openly because being removed from the case did not mean being removed from duty, and because a 3rd circle investigator had the right to enter any room in the curia except the issuance department. She sat down at the table and laid out the sheets just as she had laid them out on the footboard of the cart for 11 days in a row. She said that over the course of a month she had gathered 3 items. First, copies of Clerk Wren's Halvin records spanning 11 years, which listed 97 children recorded as having been buried, while only 3 were officially registered. Second, an extract from the burial register regarding the removal of Darius Wallendar's body 11 years ago, bearing the signatures of 2 witnesses, both of whom had died within the year. Third, a list of crowns, 41 over 411 years. She didn't find it in the disbursement department. She found it in the treasury because every crown, upon being read, received a lump sum allowance from the treasury, and the treasury recorded this as an expense. She set the sheet down and said that the expenses were consistent, and that in 39 out of 41 cases, the expense was recorded 9 or 10 days before the reading. Chiron looked at the numbers and saw the same thing he'd seen at the recruit review. He saw a man who had taken the pot off the fire before he realized what he was doing. He said that the treasury paid for the crown in advance because the crown was appointed in advance. He said that the reading wasn't a reading. It was a distribution according to a list. Irma Holt said she hadn't come for that. She said she had the right to enter the distribution department once in her life, and that every third circle investigator had that right, and that entry was permitted only with a first circle warrant or as part of the Great Check. She said the Great Reckoning would take place in 6 days. She said she would go in. She said she needed to know what to look for because she would have only as much time as it takes to read the 4 heirs. Chiron told her not to look for papers. He told her to look for 11 collars. He said that if the stones of measure bestow gifts, then the source from which they are drawn must lie somewhere, and that the collars block the lines not because they protect against the judge, but because they are made of the same material. Irma Holt wrote this down and left, but paused in the doorway and said one thing. She said that for 14 years she had traveled through the provinces taking testimonies, and that her gift could distinguish the confident from the pretenders. She said that a month ago, for the first time in her life, she had used that gift to test herself. She said she didn't like the result. What followed were 6 days that Chiron later recalled as the quietest of his 101st life. He did nothing openly. He asked. He asked Madrin to pass on 3 words to the wagon driver who hauled flour to the curia, and the driver hauled flour to the glass pits twice a month. He asked a guard at the gallery to find out whether the capital's sewing workshop had hired a new seamstress from the provinces, and the guard learned that they hadn't, that the seamstress was being held at the curia for questioning, and that Obata had been transferred to the basement workshop to sew sacks. He asked Irma Holt to find out where a sergeant from the House of Ascar named Maris Tane was currently serving, and 2 days later received a reply that the sergeant had been brought to Ortanis in the retinue of the youngest son and was staying with the household staff in the lower stables of the Murney court. He asked the kitchen staff for thread and a needle, saying he had torn his shirt. He mended the shirt himself and did a poor job of it. He did this in full view of the guards for 3 evenings in a row, and on the 4th, the guards stopped watching him. In 6 days, he made not a single exchange and revealed not a single true name, and he could not do so because the collar hung around his neck day and night. He wasn't gathering strength. He was gathering people who were already there. The night before the spark, he lay down on his bed and went over everything he had. Madrin, who's been delivering food for 8 years and whose son works in the Glass Guild's warehouses. The wagon driver who goes to the glass pits twice a month. Irma Holt, who has the right to enter the distribution department once in her lifetime. Rand with his quiver of spears. Maris Tane in the lower stables, who has already disobeyed orders once and smuggled a living supply cook out of the camp. Tessa, who is somewhere in the Askarn household's supply train, carries the Blade of Dawn, weighing 81, and doesn't know how to use it. Obad, in the basement workshop where sacks are sewn and stored. Yuna, with a grip that never loosens. And a single pledge weighing 55, locked inside itself. He added it all up and got a number. Then he added another. 9 exchanges on Sverka, 4 great houses, the capital's stone of measure with a second crack that had been there for 3 weeks. The keeper of the list with a gift weighing 88 called inheritance, and 11 collars somewhere behind the door of the distribution department. Chiron looked at his right forearm. 6 dark marks, 4 light ones. 95 lives. He thought that 411 years ago, he had walked to his execution up 12 steps, counting them, not understanding why. He thought that this time he wasn't counting steps. This time, he was counting people. In the morning, 6 men came for him and led him across the courtyard, which was packed. The 4 great houses stood beneath their banners. The house of Askar had brought their youngest son, and Lord Darren Askar stared at Chiron without looking away, not uttering a single word. The house of Wallandar stood above all others beneath an open palm bearing 4 weights. Irma Holt stood among the interrogators of the 3rd circle and did not look in his direction. The keeper of the register stood by the stone of measure, holding a sheet with 9 names in his hand. Chiron was led to the stone, his collar was removed, and peace returned all at once. The lines stretched over 2,000 people, and for a second, Chiron was dazzled by the sheer volume of writing above the courtyard. Then he raised his head and looked at the stone. The second crack had reached the base overnight. Chiron stood by the stone, taking in 2,000 lines at once. A month ago, he had read the names of 40 people in the convoy and had been exhausted by evening. Here, there were 50 times as many, and they all loomed over the courtyard at the same time. He closed his eyes. He opened them and forced himself to read them one by one as one reads an inventory. First, he read the youngest son of the Askar family. Name, the word shield. Weight, 63. And beneath that, the 3rd line, which he hadn't seen even once in the entire month. A single word issued and a date. Chiron shifted his gaze. Above the coachman at the lower gate were 2 lines, and there was no 3rd. Above the cook with the buckets were 2 lines, and there was no 3rd. Above the 3rd circle interrogators were 2 lines. Above the guards were 2 lines. He looked up at the platform of the 4 houses, and there a 3rd line stood above each one. Issued, issued, issued. He looked at this and folded the last thing that remained unfolded. A gift was not born. A gift was issued just as a salary is issued, and an ordinary person in this empire had nothing but what was within him from the very beginning, while the great houses had nothing but what was issued. The keeper of the list approached and handed him a sheet with 9 names. He said that the reading of the heirs would begin immediately after the scales were checked, and that the boy had as much time as the reading took. Chiron took the sheet. In the gallery opposite, between 2 grays, stood Yuna. Obada was not there. Irma Holt broke away from the interrogators and walked across the courtyard toward a low door beneath the western gallery, and 2 grays parted before her because a 3rd circle interrogator had the right to enter the issuance department once in a lifetime, and no one had the right to ask why. The door closed behind her. Chiron began his work. The first pair stood by the eastern banner, 2 people from the house of Urvel. He named 2 true names. The gifts switched places, and both owners flinched and glanced at each other. Chiron counted the beats. On the 100th beat, the exchange ended, and everything returned to normal. He looked at the keeper of the list. The man said nothing. Chiron formed a second pair. It worked. A third. It worked. A 4th, 5th, 6th. Everything worked. By the seventh pair, the court was no longer watching the heirs, but the boy in the canvas shirt who stood by the stone and was doing something to the people with a single voice. Lord Darren Ascarn stood in front of his banner and did not take his eyes off him. He was nearly 60. For 40 years he had upheld the Eastern Way, and for 40 years he had said the same thing at every assembly and every court. He said that the house was blood, and that blood never errs. He watched as a stranger's boy sifted through his people's gifts as one sifts through peas, and his face grew increasingly vacant. The keeper of the register stepped closer and said very quietly that the scales were reading the stone's record and that the stone had cracked, which was why the tally didn't add up. He said the boy should hurry while the record still held. And then Chiron realized that he had been given the one last thing that was missing. He turned toward the stone and spoke one sentence aloud for the entire courtyard to hear. He said that above the youngest son of the House of Ascar, the word issued was inscribed along with a date, and that this date was 9 days earlier than the day of its reading. The courtyard did not understand. The courtyard buzzed with murmurs. The keeper of the register's expression remained unchanged. Then a man carrying a leather tube stepped forward from among the scribes. It was Rand of Halvin, the one who, a month earlier, had been barred from entering beyond the reception hall. He untied the tube, pulled out a treasury statement, and began to read it aloud. He read the numbers. A lump sum payment to the heir of the House of Ascar was made on such and such a date. The reading took place 9 days later. A lump sum payment to the heir of the House of Urvel was made on such and such a date. The reading took place 10 days later. He read 8 pairs in a row, and by the 8th pair, the court fell completely silent. Lord Darren Ascarn stepped forward, snatched the sheet from him, and read it himself, and read it for a long time. Then he raised his head and looked neither at Rend nor at Chiron. He looked at his youngest son. For 40 years he had said that blood never lies. He stood in the middle of the measured court, holding a piece of paper that stated that his son's blood had been paid for from the treasury for the next 9 days. The keeper of the register raised his hand and ordered the scribe to be brought forward. And at that moment, Chiron made his 9th exchange. Not the one on the list. His eyes fell on Madrin, the cook, who for 8 years had carried food to the room with the window overlooking the stone, and whose eldest son had been declared dead last fall and had left for the barge. She stood by the lower gate with empty buckets, watching it all as one might watch a fire in a neighboring district. Above her stood the word tin, and the weight 6. Chiron looked at the heir to the Valendar house. Above him stood the word crown, and the weight 90, and the 33rd line, issued 11 days ago. Chiron spoke the 2 true names, and he spoke them louder than he had ever spoken in his 101 lifetimes. The brand burned. The heir to the House of Walendar sat down on a white stone in the courtyard and clasped his head in his hands. And the cook, Madrin, dropped both buckets and stood there, and above her appeared the word crown and the weight 90, and there was no 3rd line above her. Chiron counted the blows. 80. 90. Nothing happened on the 100th. The exchange did not sleep. The 7th division on the seal had turned black. The scales recognized it as true for the first time since the Halvin stone had cracked, and recognized it not by the record, but by the truth, because the record no longer existed. The courtyard stood in silence. 2,000 people watched the woman with the empty buckets at the lower gate. She raised her hands and looked at them, not understanding anything. The keeper of the register ordered the reading of the heirs to begin. He gave the order calmly, and he was the only person in the courtyard whose voice remained steady. The first heir was led up to the stone. He placed his palm on it. The stone remained white. No sparks, no bubbles. The assessor waited and called the second one. The stone remained white. The third, white. Then the keeper of the list himself approached the stone, placed both hands on it, and stood there for a very long time, and a thin stream of white dust ran down the crack from top to bottom. He withdrew his hands. He turned toward the courtyard and said that the great verification was being postponed. He said this, and no one believed him, yet everyone understood exactly the same thing. The stone of measure in Ortanis no longer gave a reading. For 411 years, the Kadran Empire had settled the question of who was superior, not by the sword, but by the stone. The stone's judgment was delivered before 2,000 witnesses from the 4 great houses. 6 men seized Chiron. He offered no resistance. They led him across the courtyard, and he managed to glance at the low door beneath the western gallery. The door was closed, and Irma Holt did not emerge from it. They did not lead him into the room with the window. They led him down a narrow staircase, and Chiron counted the steps out of old habit. On the 12th, he stopped counting because there were more steps. Downstairs, it smelled of wet stone and burnt wax, and he recognized the smell immediately. That was how it smelled in the Hall of Cutting in Halvin. That was how it smelled everywhere there was stone. The keeper of the list followed him down alone. He sat down on a bench opposite the grate and said that now he would explain everything to the end, because there was nothing left to hide and because the boy would need to know. He said that the stone would crack twice. He said that the judge would cause the first crack. He said that the second crack would be caused by the bottom. He said that 411 years ago, the founder had gathered into a single stone everything in the 9 kingdoms that had not yet been gathered, and that all the imperial standard stones had been cut from that stone, and that since then, the empire had not produced new gifts, but had distributed them from this reserve. He said that the reserve was finite. He said that for the last 80 years, the distribution has come from the bottom layer, and that the bottom layer does not replenish itself, so it must be replenished. Chiron asked, with what? The keeper of the register replied calmly and without a single hesitation. He said that dust is not emptiness. He said that dust is rejection. He said that within a person who has been rejected lies the uncollected, and that the uncollected is extracted. He said that the Glass Guild handles this, that the ritual takes place once every 3 months, and that a person endures 3 rituals. He said that about 4,000 people pass through the glass pits each year, that this is less than 1 in 200, and that 411 years of peace cost exactly that much. Then he said the most important thing. He said that there was nothing left to bestow, and that an empire in which a gift cannot be bestowed upon an heir would crumble into 9 kingdoms within 10 years. He said there would be no new gifts, and that the only thing left to do was to redistribute what was already there. He said that for this, the Judge of Judgments was needed. He said that 411 years ago, the judge was not needed and was therefore executed. He said that now the judge was needed, and that was why he had been transported alive twice. He stood up and walked toward the staircase. On the first step, he stopped and spoke his final words. He said that he was holding the seamstress with the unregistered gift 2 doors down from here, and that any gift received outside the registry is subject to confiscation by law, and that the Glass Guild carries out the confiscation, and that the procedure is the same for everyone. The retrieval was scheduled for the 3rd day, and Chiron learned the exact time from the man who was guarding him. The guard's name was Hesk. He had served in the basement of the Measured Court for 19 years, and he possessed a tin and a gift called Hearing, which allowed him to hear footsteps through 2 doors. He never spoke to the prisoners. On the second day, he spoke of his own accord. He said he had seen the courtyard on the day of the flash from his post at the lower gate. He said that for 19 years he had carried the keys, and for 19 years he had known that a person is worth only as much as has been invested in them, and that this was not cruelty, but order. He said that now there was a single images in his mind, and he could not shake it off. A cook with empty buckets. He said he'd known Madrin for 8 years, that she used to bring him bread in the mornings, and that she had a son working on the barges. He fell silent and stood there for a moment, then said that the extraction was taking place in the sack workshop because it had a vaulted ceiling. Chiron asked who was conducting it. Hesk said that the ritual master from Glass Pits was coming, and that he always arrived with 2 people, always in a wagon through the lower gate, and that wagons inside the curia weren't searched. Chiron sat down on the floor and began to count. He had 3 light divisions. 1 pledge weighing 55, locked inside him along with the collar, 94 lives. 2 of his own, 2 doors down from here. The collar had been placed on him immediately after the verification, and since then he hadn't read a single line. And he had 3 days. He spent them doing what he had done on such days in 94 other lives. He talked. By the end of the first day, Hesk had brought him water twice. By the end of the second, Hesk told him that the sack-making workshop was located above the old drain and that the drain led out to the cart yard. By the morning of the third day, he said he would be leaving his post at 9 o'clock and that he wouldn't be taking the key to the lower gallery with him that day because he would place it on the lintel, just as he had done 19 years ago when he handed over his shift without looking. He said this to the wall and left, and never went down into the basement again. During those same 3 days, Yuna was brought to Chiron twice. The keeper of the list understood the mechanics. The first time, she said she wouldn't ask him for anything. The second time, she said nothing. Her lip was split, and she kept her right hand tucked into her sleeve. Chiron could see that her fingers wouldn't unclench because her gift was active, yet she had nothing to hold on to. He looked at her and understood very clearly that 4 months ago he'd given her that grip in the lower passageway leading to the pier, and that back then it had saved her life. But now it had become a criminal offense. He told her one thing. He said that if tomorrow they ordered her to stand at attention, she should stand at attention, and that she would have to run later, and she shouldn't be the first to do so. She looked at him and nodded once. Maris Tane arrived at the basement on the evening of the third day, openly wearing the colors of House Askar. He was let in because House Askar stood in Mernoi Devor with full rights, and because a sergeant wearing the house's colors raises no questions among any guard in the Empire. He stood by the bars and remained silent for a long time. For 20 years he had preached in the barracks that the gift is order. He had repeated this for 8 years to his young master, and he had repeated it at inspections, and he had repeated it to his men in the ridge an hour before they were struck down by arrows from alderwood by men of his own house. He said he had been in the courtyard at Sverka and had heard the treasury statement being read. He said his lord hadn't left his tent for 3 days. He said he'd served the blood for 20 years and had learned 3 days ago that the blood had been purchased from the treasury for the next 9 days. Then he said why he'd come. He said that a camp cook named Tessa had been traveling in the Askarn household supply train for the past 3 months under a false identity, and that he had been hiding her himself but could no longer do so because the household was seriously searching for her. He said that the woman carried the Blade of Dawn, weighing 81, but did not know how to use it and was afraid of her own hands. He said that if the boy promised her life, 40 men from his squad would go wherever he told them to. Chiron said he didn't promise life to anyone. He said he promised only one thing. He said that whoever went with him would know what they were getting into, and that in this empire, no one had been given such a promise for 411 years. Maristane thought for a moment and said that was enough. What followed was an hour and a half that would later be retold in Ortanis for 3 years straight. At 9 o'clock, Hesk handed off his shift and placed the key on the lintel. The ritual master's supply wagon entered the lower gate without being searched. In the wagon, beneath the sacks, lay 2 of Maristane's 10 men. The master of ceremonies and his men descended into the sack workshop, where they were met not by the Greys. Chiron emerged from the lower gallery on his own and stepped out first because he knew that everything depended on one thing. He was wearing a collar and couldn't read anything. Without the collar, he was useless, and only someone with the Curia's key could remove it. The master of ceremonies carried such a key because the extraction is performed with the lines deactivated. Maristane grabbed him by the throat right at the door and held him there while Chiron pulled the key from his belt. The lock clicked once. The world returned all at once, and it returned so abruptly that Chiron was blinded for 2 breaths. He opened his eyes and immediately found the line above Obad, who had been held in that same workshop for 3 weeks. Name. The word thread. Weight. 12. The very same gift that Chiron had given to Yuna 4 months ago in the lower passage, which the scales had sent to its rightful place on their own, and which now hung above the former shelter guard, because the scales always placed the thread where it was actually used for sewing. Obad sat on the sacks, sewing, and did not look up until someone touched his shoulder. Chiron told him it was going to hurt, and that this was the last time. Obad stood up and said he was ready. And then Chiron released what he had been carrying inside him for 26 days. He spoke one true name, Obad's name, and placed a pledge within it, 55 units of a stranger's weight. The gift was called a battering ram and had been taken in the ridge from a man in Askar's house who was making his way through a crowd of living people toward a wagon. Obada buckled. He stood like that for 5 beats, then straightened up and looked at his hands that had grabbed children by the collar for 16 years and had been sewing sacks for the past 4 months. The 5th division on the brand was now complete. The pawnshop account was closed. In that very second, Chiron lost his 76th life, and he lost it standing up. He remembered the mountains there. He remembered the snow on the rocks. He didn't remember why he'd spent 40 years there. 93. What followed was quick and simple. Obad tore down the door to the sack workshop along with the door frame. He tore down the second door. He held the lower gate open while the carts passed through and held it against 14 men, and not one of the 14 could budge him an inch. Yuna was let out third. Renda was let out fourth, and he clutched the tube to his chest the whole way. Madrin walked out on her own, carrying the buckets, because the buckets were hers, and it didn't occur to her to leave them behind. Maristane led his 40 men out of the stables and marched them under the colors of House Askarn, and not a single checkpoint in Ortanis stopped the House Askarn column marching south through the night. Only one person did not leave. Irma Holt did not leave the distribution department that evening or that night. Chiron ordered the wagons to stop at the first bridge across the bend and said he would return for her. Maristane said that if they did, they would lose everything and everyone. And then Madrin spoke up from the front wagon. She said she'd had a pass to the Curia kitchen for 8 years, that the kitchen opened at 4 in the morning, and that they didn't lock it because flour was delivered every morning. She said she would go herself, and that no one would stop her because she had been seen in the courtyard on Sverka, and because in Ortanis, women with a 90-weight crown were now feared more than the guards. She said this calmly and did not ask for permission. She returned 2 hours later, and she did not return alone. Irma Holt sat in the cart until dawn, silent, holding a leather folder on her lap. Inside were 3 sheets of paper taken from the issuance department. First sheet, inventory list. 11 collars of calibrated glass. The 12th is missing. The second sheet, the glass pit's ritual register for the current year. Next to the name Selma Var, age 71, was a note regarding her first ritual and the scheduling of her second in 11 days. The third sheet was not paper. It was a charcoal sketch drawn by her own hand. Chiron looked at it and realized he was looking at the very foundation of the entire empire. Beneath the measured court, in a closed chamber, stood a stone. Not a measured pillar, a boulder 3 times a man's height, with even saw marks on all 4 sides. The first stone, from which all the others had been cut 411 years ago. It was a 2-day journey to the glass pits, but the convoy covered the distance in a day and a half because it was traveling under the colors of the House of Askarn and repeated the same message at every checkpoint. The House of Askar is escorting the shipment. No one checked it even once. Chiron rode in the first wagon with Irma Holt, and the whole way they pieced together what they both now knew. He asked her what was behind the low door. She told him briefly. A hall 30 paces long. Shelves filled with inventories spanning 411 years. At the far end, a sunken lattice floor and light shining from beneath it. She said they don't light lamps there. She said the stone itself glows. She said she stood above the lattice for half an hour, and during that half hour she realized one thing. The light shone unevenly. It wandered across the boulder the way water wanders in a boiler as it runs dry. She said that for 14 years, her gift had distinguished the confident from the pretenders, and that for the first time she was looking not at a person. She said the stone was unsure. The glass pits lay in an old mine south of the bend. 3 rows of low buildings, furnaces, a dock on the canal where the glass guild's barges arrived, and above it all, 4 ceremonial arches made of uniform glass, each as tall as a man. The column stood behind the ridge at sunset, and Chiron spent half the day looking down, not letting anyone move. He had done this in 40 other people's lives and knew that impatience kills more surely than arrows. He counted the posts, 18 guards, 2 ritual masters, 40 workers from among the freemen, and 216 people in the barracks behind the second row, whom they called here not people, but stands. Maris Tane suggested striking at night. Chiron said they would strike in the morning, at the hour of the ritual, because at that hour the vaults were open and the guards stood inside rather than outside. By evening, another man arrived, alone and without a horse. Velt Askar had been walking from Ortanis itself for 4 days. He was 22 years old and had been the province's 3rd-ranked swordsman until the gift of the hearth, weighing 7, came into his possession. For 3 months he hadn't left his tent, and for 3 months the household had been telling everyone that the young master was ill. He stood before the bonfire and said he had not come to make peace. He said he had come because an extract had been read on Sverka, and that the treasury had paid 9 days' worth in advance for his brother, which meant they had paid for him as well, and thus his entire life up to the age of 15 had been nothing but a piece of paper from the treasury. He said they had taken the gift away from him, and for 4 months he had hated the boy for it. He said that now he understood that the gift had been given to him, and that what had been given had been taken away. He said he didn't know who he was without it, and that he was going down because he wanted to test things with his own hands, not with a coat of arms. Maris Tane had followed this man for 20 years. He listened in silence and said nothing. Obad gave Velt an axe. The morning began with smoke rising from the first furnace at the pier, and the first vault was opened. The ritual proceeded as follows. A person was led into the vault. The master closed the hatch. The glass began to glow from the inside, from the bottom up. After a third of an hour, the hatch was opened, and the person was led out. He walked on his own, but did not walk immediately, and did not always recognize the one leading him. After the third ritual, they were not let out. Chiron watched this for exactly 1/3 of an hour and then looked away. They went down an hour later when the second vault was opened. 18 guards faced 43, plus a man wielding a battering ram weighing 55. Obad removed the first row of gates from their hinges in a single motion. Maris Tane led his men through the passage between the furnaces, guiding them as only a man who had spent 20 years teaching other men's sons to maintain formation could. Velt Asgarn walked in the second row with an axe and, for the first time in his life, fought against men who were not afraid of his coat of arms. He fought poorly, but did not retreat. Chiron followed behind them and did not fight. He was working. He read the lines above the guards, calling out the true names in pairs and swapping the gifts of the 18 men so that the archer received the cook's hearing and the one holding the bolt received the scribe's eyes. Not a single swap was permanent. Everyone was asleep after 100 blows. That was more than enough. A quarter of an hour later, the guards lay bound with their own belts. The ritual masters were taken alive at the second archway. Chiron stepped under the archway and saw what he had seen 100 times in 100 alien worlds, and still could not get used to it. A 71-year-old woman sat on a low bench by the wall, her hands resting on her knees. Selma Var. He didn't call her by her name. He called her by her true name, and she raised her head. 2 lines stood above her. Name. The word bitterness. Weight. 2. For 40 years, her gift had weighed 9 and allowed her to distinguish real root from fake by taste, and on this gift, she supported herself and 8 elderly neighbors. After the first ritual, she had 2 left. Chiron sat down on the floor in front of her. She didn't recognize him right away. Then she spoke a single sentence in the same voice she'd used 4 months ago to lay down her terms to him at the door of the mending shop. She said he'd come back to bargain again. Chiron replied that he hadn't. He stepped out from under the archway and walked toward the second row of barracks. 216 people. He read them off one by one. Above each name were 2 lines, and the weight ranged from 0 to 3. Everything inside them had been removed and poured into the bottom layer of the first stone so that the great houses might receive their heirs with a crown weighing 90. He stopped at the 14th person, a 16-year-old boy, thin. Above him was the name that Chiron had heard for 8 days straight in the room with a window overlooking the stone, the eldest son of the cook Madron. Chiron led him outside to the carts, brought him to his mother, stepped back 10 paces, and looked away. Then he did what he had come to do. He placed 2 people beside him, the master of the right, who had closed the gate for 9 years, and above whom stood the words precision and weight 44, and the old woman Selma Var, who had 2 left. He named the 2 true names. The brand grew warm. The master of the right sat down on the ground and began groping blindly with his hands because his fingers had known the lock by touch for 9 years and had forgotten it in a single heartbeat. And Selma Var rose from the bench on her own. Chiron counted. On the 100th beat, the exchange did not sleep. The 8th division turned black. The scales recognized it as correct, and they recognized it quickly, and for the first time, Chiron felt nothing from this but cold, because he understood that the scales would now always agree with him, and that this made him not a judge, but the final authority without oversight. That very night, he lost his 3rd life. He remembered the rain there and the wooden bridge, but he could not recall a single word of what he had said there 40 years ago. 92. Drest arrived at the Yamas on the 2nd day with a detachment of the Halvan Guard because the barges hadn't arrived on schedule and because he now served with the Guild of Measure, wore a new cloak, and received a salary 3 times that of the orphanage. They took him on the road without a single blow. They led him to the bonfire, and he remained silent and waited. Chiron looked at him, read the line, and saw what he already knew. Name,
Word, bone, weight, 19. There was no third line. Dressed was given nothing. Dressed was just like everyone else in that barracks, and he alone had not been written off as dust. Chiron ordered him to be released. Obad said it was a mistake. Maris Tane said it was a mistake. Chiron spoke a single sentence, and he said it in front of everyone.
He said that the man who had sold him for 40 gold pieces had received exactly what he'd asked for, and that taking it back from him was not the judge's job, but the job of the wronged party. Drest was released on foot, without a horse, and he headed north. 2 days later, he was seen in a Halvin tavern, where he was loudly proclaiming that a boy from the orphanage had led a rebellion in the glass pits, and that soon this story would be known in every city. He told this story in exchange for a drink. In 1 week, he had done more for Chiron than 20 messengers could have. By the third day, 400 people had gathered in the pits. 216 former pawns, 40 free workers who had gone their own way, 43 of Maris Tane's men, people from the surrounding villages who'd come to watch and hadn't left. And then Chiron got his new problem, and he got it at the very moment when everything seemed won. Irma Holt brought him the list of rituals and told him to count along with her. 216 people here, 3 more yamas in the empire, and 9,000 names in the registry over the past 3 years, of whom fewer than a third are still alive. She said he'd taken a single spoonful from the bottom layer. She said that even if he burned all 4 yamas, the offerings had already been poured into the first stone and lay there, and that they could only be retrieved from there and only in their entirety. And in the evening, news arrived from the north. The House of Askar and the House of Urvel had withdrawn their men from the eastern garrisons. Both houses had refused to acknowledge the readings for the past 3 weeks, and both houses had begun mustering their armies. An empire in which the stone had ceased to declare who was superior began to settle the matter by the sword on the 9th day. It took 11 days to assemble the army, and for all 11 days, Chiron marched north. He never fought a single battle. He did something else, and he did it at 3 different locations, repeating the same actions at each one. At the Calver Ford, he approached the outpost alone and called out the centurion's true name and the middle name of the man who was bringing bread to the outpost, and he exchanged their gifts for 100 heartbeats. And during those 100 heartbeats, the centurion understood with his hands what it meant to be a cart driver carrying a load of 4. The outpost let the column pass without a fight. In Retving, he gathered 300 people in the square and read lines aloud to them one after another. Above every third line was the word issued, along with the date and city. By evening, he closed the gates to the tax collectors at the Irvel house. In Stadimost, he did nothing at all. He didn't have to. The people already knew and came out on their own, bringing out to the procession 2 guild elders who had spent 11 years reading the steps according to the decree from the capital. Chiron ordered that the elders not be touched, and he ordered it loudly. So they marched for 11 days. By the end, the column was no longer a column. It consisted of 900 people without a banner, with 6 carts and a single leather folder containing 3 sheets of paper taken from the issuance department. Olvin Rhett came out to meet them on the 4th day of the journey. He had left Ortanis 3 months earlier for the eastern passes, having surrendered his gray horse, and now arrived on a stranger's horse and in a stranger's clothes, and he did not come alone. Following him were 200 men from the eastern garrison, led by the very same lord from whom Chiron had been forced to take a gift weighing 74 at the measured court. The lord did not offer his hand nor utter a word of greeting. He said he had not come to seek a return and that nothing could be returned to him now. He said that 3 months ago he had been reduced to nothing in a single stroke, and that for the first 2 months he had wanted to kill someone for it, and that in the third month the treasury statement had reached him. He said that all his life he had considered himself a man who had been given more than others, and that now he knew they had simply written him a larger amount. Olvin Rhett stood nearby and said nothing. He was 2 years older than he had been in Griada, and 2 years older than he had been in Ortanis. He told Chiron one thing. He said that for 2 years he had believed in the list of forbidden classes, that for 3 months he had believed in nothing, and that now, at last, he knew what it was called. He said that the list did not protect the empire. He said that the list protected the gift. On the 8th day of their journey, Irma Holt finished reading the 3rd sheet and called Chiron to the campfire that night. She unfolded the sketch of the first stone and placed next to it the line burned into the lead box, which she had read aloud in the Hall of Cutting in Haven. She said that for 4 months she had read that line as a sentence, and that yesterday she had read it as an instruction. There was only one line: deliver the bearer alive and unharmed. She said that 411 years ago there was neither mercy nor caution in that line. She said that the judge was being taken to the stone because the stone needed the judge. She said that the reserve in the first stone did not gather itself. She said that only one who knows how to extract and hold can gather what has not been gathered from all 9 kingdoms into a single mass. And then Chiron spoke aloud what had been forming within him for 3 months, what he had not dared to finish saying until that night. He said that 411 years ago, the first stone had been filled by the Judge of Judgments. He said that he himself was that judge. He said that he remembers the 12 steps, and he remembers the coat of arms, and he remembers the motto, and he remembers nothing in between. He said that he now understands why he doesn't remember. He said that for every eternal exchange, the scales take one past life, and that if a person makes thousands of exchanges in a row, by the end, not a single name remains of him. He said he wasn't executed for what he was capable of doing. He was executed when he came to an end. He said that 100 lives are neither a punishment nor a wandering. He said that 100 lives are a tally given to him so he could start over, and that someone very patient waited 411 years until the tally was needed again. Irma Holt asked who had issued it. Chiron looked at his brand. 8 dark divisions, 2 light ones. He said he would ask himself. The keeper of the list met them on the 9th day on the Ortanis Road at the milestone, and he was alone, without guards, no banner. He was standing on the road waiting, and 900 people stopped 200 paces away because no one knew what to do with a man standing alone. Chiron went out to him himself. He wasn't wearing a collar. It was the 12th day, and he read the line immediately and now read it in its entirety. The name he had heard on Sverka, the word inheritance, weight 88, and the 3rd line, issued, and a date from 400 years ago. The keeper of the list said he was glad the boy had finally finished reading. He said he wouldn't deny it because it was too late to deny it, and because there was nothing left to hide. He said that the gift of inheritance allowed him to transfer himself entirely into the designated heir, and that over the course of 411 years, he had done this 19 times, and that each time the body was new, and that each time they took a stranger's name from the burial registry. He said that the first time he'd done this was in the year of the empire's founding, that he'd gone by a different name back then, and that this name was engraved on every measuring post in the empire. Chiron asked why he'd executed the judge back then. The founder replied calmly and without a single hesitation, and that was the worst part. He said that by that time, The judge had filled the stone and had become superfluous. He said that a man capable of extracting the gift is as dangerous to a state built on distribution as a blacksmith is to a castle. He said he harbored no animosity toward him. He said they had worked together for 52 years and that the judge himself had proposed gathering the uncollected into a single stone to end the 200-year-old bloodshed over territory. He said that the judge was an idealist and that an idealist must not be left near a task already completed. And then he made a proposal, and he meant it seriously. He said that reserves were running low, that the empire was crumbling, and that together they would have time to sort through everything that remained and maintain peace for another 100 years. He said that the boy had already made 8 eternal exchanges, that all 8 scales had accepted them, and that this meant the boy judged correctly. He said he was offering him a place beside him, not beneath him. Chiron asked how many people would pass through the pits over the course of 100 years under such an arrangement. The founder named the number without hesitation: 400,000. He stated it just as matter-of-factly as he had everything else. And then Chiron named 2 true names. The first was the founder's own name. The second name stood 200 paces behind. He named Velta Ascarna, 22 years old, gift of the hearth, weight 7. The man who, 4 months ago, had taken a cauldron off the fire in the middle of a review, and who had walked for 4 days to test himself with his own hands. The brand burned so fiercely that Chiron dropped to one knee. The founder of the Kydran Empire remained standing on the road, and for the first time during the entire conversation, something changed on his face. He raised his hand and looked at it. He tried to do what he had done 19 times over 411 years. He couldn't. And 200 paces behind him, Velt Askarn dropped his axe and sat down on the ground, because 88 units of a stranger's weight and 411 years of a stranger's memory, which he hadn't asked for, suddenly flooded into him. Chiron counted the blows. On the 100th, the exchange did not sleep. The 9th division turned black. The scales declared it correct. He lost his 81st life while kneeling on the Ortanis road, and he lost it all at once. He remembered the river there. He did not remember a single face. 91. 2 men took the founder by the arms, and he offered no resistance. He was now exactly the same age as the body he had entered 11 years ago. 51 years old, not a day more. He looked at Chiron and said the last thing he would say to him in this life. He said that the boy had won the argument but lost the case. He said that he had removed the one who held the empire together but had not removed the foundation upon which it stood. He said that the first stone lay beneath the measured court, and that within it lay everything taken from the 9 kingdoms and from the 9,000 children, and that now no one ruled over it. He said that in a year the 4 houses would fight over the stone, and that in 3 years it would be split into 4 pieces. He said the boy should have agreed. Chiron stood up and looked at his forearm. 9 dark marks, 1 light one. Ortanis opened the gates at dawn. He opened them himself, and that was worse than any siege. Chiron entered the city at the head of 900 men and understood everything within the first city block. The measuring posts at the intersections had been knocked down. 3 men hung near the western market, and they had not been hanged by sentence. The guards at the curia of the cutter were not the usual gray-clad ones. Men of the house of Urvel stood there, and they had been standing there for 3 days. The empire, in which the stone had ceased to speak of who was superior, did not collapse over 10 years as its founder had promised. It began to crumble in 13 days. Maristane took the measure court by noon and took it with almost no bloodshed, because the people of the House of Ervil did not want to die for a building in which nothing was read anymore. Chiron went down to the western gallery at the 4th hour and came back up with 4 others: Irma Holt, Selma Var, Una, and Velt Askar, who was being led by the arms, who hadn't slept for 3 days, and within whom lay 411 years of someone else's memories. The circulation desk was a hall 30 paces long, shelves with catalogs. At the far end was a slatted floor. Chiron approached, looked down, and saw a light. A block 3 times a man's height, with even saw marks on all 4 sides. The first stone glowed unevenly from within, and the light moved across it like water in a boiling kettle nearing its end. A crack ran from top to bottom, falling short of the bottom by a palm's width. Chiron descended the iron staircase, placed his hand on the stone, and the world turned upside down. He read it as he read people. Above the stone stood a single line. 1. A name. And that name was his own name from his 47th life. Not the founder's name, not the name of the empire. For 411 years, the stone had been attributed to the one who had imbued it with life. He stood below, his palm resting on the glass, recalling the 12 steps, and finally remembered what had happened in between. He remembered 52 years of work. He remembered 9 kingdoms and 200 years of bloodshed over territory. He recalled how he himself had proposed gathering the scattered pieces into a single block and distributing from there according to merit rather than bloodline. He recalled how that was indeed the case for the first 30 years. He recalled how, in the 31st year, a man with the gift of inheritance approached the stone and said that counting by merit takes too long, but counting by surname is quick. He remembered himself agreeing because a weary idealist always agrees to the quick solution, and he remembered the price he paid for each filling. He climbed upstairs, sat down on the slatted floor, and told his people what he had realized. He said that everything taken out over 411 years lay within the stone. He said it couldn't be distributed one by one because that would require thousands of eternal exchanges, and he had only one bright division left. He said it couldn't be left behind because people were already fighting over the stone 3 blocks away. He said it couldn't be split because then everything that had been extracted would simply scatter and never return to anyone. He said there was only one option left, and that he didn't know if it would work. He said that the scales swap the places of 2 people. He said that until now, those 2 had been human beings. He said he would try to place not 2 people, but 2 sides on the scales. What the empire had bestowed over 411 years, and what lay within the stone, unassigned, and to swap their places all at once. Irma Holt asked what would happen to those who had been granted the gift. Chiron answered directly and without mincing words. He said they would remain themselves without the gift. He said that the great houses would, in a single hour, become ordinary people. He said that the 4,000 people in the yamas and all those still alive after the rites would get back what lay within them. He said that along with this, hundreds of thousands would lose the very foundation upon which they had built their lives, and that a blacksmith would remain a blacksmith, and a centurion would remain a centurion, but many would no longer be any of the people they had considered themselves to be. He said that this was not mercy, and that he would not call it mercy. Una asked how he would pay. Chiron showed the brand. 1 light division. He said he did not know the price in advance, and said that for 9 divisions, the scales had taken 9 of his past lives, and that the 10th was worth a 10th. Selma Var spoke first, just as she had at the door of the mending shop 4 months ago. She said she had set a condition for him, that he had broken it twice, and that now he was about to break it a third time, and this time for the entire empire, because none of the hundreds of thousands had given him their consent. Chiron answered her, and he answered in front of everyone, and it was the only time during the entire journey that he raised his voice. He said that the exiled had never been asked for their consent. He said that the children on the barges had not been asked. He said that she herself had not been asked when she was entered into the register of rights. He said that for 411 years, no one in this empire had ever had a choice, and that he could not restore that choice without taking away someone else's comfort. Then he fell silent and said more quietly that she was right, and that this was not an excuse but a calculation, and that he was doing this knowing he had no right. Selma Var looked at him for a long time and said that she now trusted him more than before. It had begun upstairs. The house of Ervil had brought 400 men to the measured court, and Maris Tane was guarding the gates with 200, while Obad held the lower ones. Chiron heard this through the vault. He went down to the stone one last time and placed both palms on it. Velt Askarn approached and sat down on the bottom step of the staircase. The memory of the founder dwelt within him, and he spoke with great effort, using words not his own. He said that the boy would not be able to name the two true names because the sides had no names. Chiron replied that one of them did have a name. He said that the stone was registered in his name. He said that for 411 years, everything granted by the empire had been issued through his hand and recorded in his name. He said that the first true name was his own. He said that the second would be the name of the one lying at the bottom, and that the unnamed one had no name. Therefore, he would name it as it was called before all stones and before all kingdoms. He would call it human. And Chiron named two names. He named his true name from his 47th life, the one that had been erased from all the empire's registers. And he named the second. The brand did not burn. The brand went out. The light left the first stone from the bottom up and departed entirely, and the distribution hall grew dark. Then it grew light again, because the light emerged through the vault and spread throughout the city. To whoever was standing on the roof in Ortanis at that hour, it seemed as though low white water was flowing through the streets. It flowed through the neighborhoods. It flowed along the highways in all four directions and reached the empire's borders by the third night. And in every person it touched, two things switched places. Among the 400 people at Ervil's house beneath the gates of the measured court, their arms dropped simultaneously, and they stood looking at one another, none of them understanding what had happened. In the glass pits, 216 people in the barracks raised their heads at the same time. In Halvin, the women from the sewing workshop saw that their forewoman suddenly looked exactly as she had 30 years ago, before the reading. In the four great houses, at the same hour, not a single weight remained above 40. Chiron stood below, his palms pressed against the cooling glass, and the scales took their toll. They took more than one life. They took the entire count. 91 lives flowed out of him like water from a broken cauldron. 20 worlds, 100 foreign languages, salt pans and a city on the back of a beast, and 3 weeks on a foreign throne, and a bridge in the rain and the steppe, and snow on stone, and a woman with the scent of resin in her hair. He clung to the stone and lost it all. And the last thing he lost was the 47th life and 12 steps. The 10th division on the brand hadn't turned black. The brand had faded. The skin on his right forearm had become ordinary skin with the number 41 burned into it, a number they'd branded on him when he was 4. Up above, they'd stopped fighting because there was nothing left to fight for. What followed was what followed. the Kagran Empire did not break up into 9 kingdoms. It broke up into 22 free lands and spent 11 years trying to reassemble itself, but never fully succeeded. The Curia of Grinding was dissolved in the 3rd month. The records department was raided, and the ledgers spanning 411 years were carried out into the courtyard and read aloud by neighborhood for half a year. And that reading accomplished more than any army ever could. Irma Holt took charge of what remained of the inquiry and, as her first act, conducted the only true reconciliation in the history of the empire. 9,000 names from the Registry of Rights. 2,840 were found alive. She searched for the rest for another 9 years and found none, and she recorded this in her report just as matter-of-factly as she recorded everything else. Rand pored over the Halvin books for 11 years, and based on his findings, 48 people were brought to trial, the first of whom was a man who had lived for 41 years under the name of Andris Kale. Madrin returned to Halvin with her son and a Vence weighing 90, and for the rest of her life she swept the courtyard, fed the neighborhood, and answered every question by saying that being a cook was also a weight. Obad, with a Terran weighing 55, spent 5 years tearing down the walls of the glass pits with his own hands and tore down all 4 of them. Selma Var lived another 9 years, running her mending shop in the same place and accepting not money from people, but a favor for the next person in line. Maris Tane led his people to the eastern passes and kept them there for 13 years. Olvin Red stayed with him. Tessa did not give the Blade of Dawn to anyone. She learned to wield it at the age of 42, and the 3 Freelands feared her. Velt Askarn lived with another's memory for 8 months, and during that time, he dictated to Irma Holt what the founder had remembered, producing 4 volumes before dying in his sleep. He was buried under his real name. The founder himself lived out his days in the basement of the Measured Court until he was 62, and until his very last day, he told everyone who came that order would be restored and that the place would be torn down anyway. Drest ran a tavern in Halvin and, over a drink, would recount how it all happened, lying differently each time. And the 15-year-old boy walked out of the release office on his own 2 feet and stopped on the top step because he didn't recognize a single face. He didn't remember the ridge. He didn't remember Yama. He didn't remember a single one of his 100 lives, nor did he remember a single person standing around him. He remembered the shelter on Dolgovaya Mera. He remembered room number 41, the receipt under the mug, and the price of 8 silver weights. He didn't remember anything else. Yuna took his hand. He didn't know who she was. He asked her only one thing, and he asked it as one would ask a stranger. He asked how much he was worth now. Yuna answered him with what was true in this country for the first time in 411 years. She said that no one counted that anymore.